Tonight, we're going deep into the complete history of Aegon the Conqueror and the Seven Kingdoms. This topic gives us a lot to trace through, but I'll keep the delivery calm enough for a quiet night. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Before the dragons came, the land we now call Westeros was not one nation, but 7 separate, warring realms. For thousands of years, kings of brass, iron, and gold fought over borders that shifted with every passing generation. To the north, the kings of winter ruled from Winterfell, their domain vast, cold, and isolated. In the fertile south, the kings of the Reach held court amidst fields of gold, while the fierce Storm Kings guarded the rugged cliffs of the east. It was a fractured continent, defined by ancient blood feuds, regional pride, and endless conflict. But on the rocky island of Dragonstone, just off the eastern coast, sat the last remnants of old Valyria. The Targaryens had lived there for over a century, having fled the doom that consumed their ancestral homeland. They were dragon lords, keepers of a power that the rest of the world had only heard of in whispered legends. At the center of this family stood Aegon, a quiet, deliberate man who looked westward, not with simple greed, but with a grand, singular vision. Beside him were his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, each a formidable ruler and warrior in her own right. Together, they possessed 3 living dragons, the last of their kind, Meraxes, and the monstrous Balerion, the Black Dread, whose wings were said to swallow the sun. In the year 2 BC, 2 years before the transition to the new royal calendar, Aegon made his move. He did not sail with a massive armada or an unstoppable legion. Instead, he landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with fewer than 1,600 men. It was a force so small that the neighboring kings viewed it as a minor nuisance rather than a threat of conquest. On the highest of the 3 hills overlooking the bay, Aegon's men hastily erected a modest wooden fortress of earth and timber, which they called the Aegonfort. It was a humble beginning for a place that would one day become King's Landing, the bustling, stone-walled capital of an entire continent. From this muddy foothold, the Targaryens sent out their terms. Aegon demanded that the lords of Westeros bend the knee, promising that those who did would keep their lands, titles, and honors, while those who resisted would be utterly destroyed. It was a political calculation, as much as a military campaign. Aegon understood that sword and shield could only do so much. To truly unite a continent, he would need to marry his overwhelming aerial supremacy with compromise, ancient rituals, and new symbols of legitimacy. He would need to forge a single realm out of 7 distinct peoples, a task that would test not only his dragons, but his capacity to govern. Over the next 2 years, the landscape of Westeros would be forever altered. Great castles that had stood for centuries would crumble under the heat of dragonfire, and ancient royal lines would end in ash. Yet, even as the dragons flew, Aegon's conquest was marked by moments of profound diplomacy, unexpected surrenders, and the creation of lasting institutions. Only the far south, the desert sands of Dawn, would resist his advance, leaving his dream of a fully unified realm incomplete, yet setting the stage for a dynasty that would endure for nearly 300 years. But to understand that dynasty, the dynasty that would rule for nearly 300 years, you have to look back. Back before the landing at the Blackwater, back before the Aegonfort, back before the Iron Throne was ever a whisper. You have to look at the fire that created the Targaryens, and the ash that nearly erased them. The story of Aegon the Conqueror does not begin in a war camp on the shores of Westeros. It begins in Hell, the 14 Flames of Valyria. The Valyrian freehold was the greatest civilization the world had ever seen, a union of 40 dragonlord families who ruled a vast empire from a volcanic peninsula in Essos. They rode dragons, worked magic that could shape stone like clay, and forged steel that never dulled. The Targaryens were one of these 40 families, but they were not the greatest. They were conservative, holding to the old ways, keeping to themselves. When Rhaenys the Dreamer foresaw the destruction of Valyria in a prophetic vision, her father Lord Aenar took the warning seriously. He sold his holdings, gathered his gold, his dragons, and his family, and sailed west to the farthest fortress of the Freehold, a lonely volcanic island named Dragonstone. They were mocked for this flight, but 12 years later, the doom came. The doom was not a simple volcanic eruption, it was a magical cataclysm of unimaginable scale. The 14 flames exploded simultaneously, the earth shattered, the sky turned to solid ash, the sea boiled, the capital city of Valyria was swallowed by the ocean. Every single dragon tethered to the land died in that instant. The empire of the Dragon Lords was gone. The catastrophic destruction of the Valyrian freehold left House Targaryen as the sole surviving Dragon Lords of the Western world. They alone had escaped with their beasts intact. 5 dragons in total, enough to change the world, but a fraction of what had been lost. They were the last living connection to the greatest power humanity had ever known, and they were utterly alone. Aenar's son, Lord Gaemon the Glorious, took command of this heavy legacy. He looked at the continent to the west. It was a land of barbarians and kings, primitives who worshipped trees and stars. They had no dragons, but they had numbers. They would surely come for the last of the winged terrors. Gaemon decided to make sure that when they came, they would break against the walls of his fortress. He reinforced Dragonstone with spells and stone. He expanded the caverns deep within the island to house his growing dragons. He built a formidable fleet. He turned the island into a grim, isolated outpost, a monument to survival, on the very edge of Westeros. And there, the Targaryens stayed. For decades, for a century and more, they did not attempt to conquer. They did not spread their influence. They were too few, too raw from their wound, too aware of their vulnerability. They turned inward. They followed the Valyrian custom of brother marrying sister to keep their blood and their dragon bonds strong. They watched. Decades of isolation turned the Targaryens from active conquerors into watchful observers of the fractured continent to their west. They watched the Storm Kings and the Gardeners bleed each other over borderlands. They watched the Ironborn burn the Riverlands and salt the fields of the Reach. They watched the North grow cold and distant. They watched Dawn resist every invasion. They saw the endless wars, the shifting alliances, the petty hatreds. They saw that the 7 kingdoms were powerful, but they were divided, and division could be exploited. It was into this world of watching and waiting that Aegon Targaryen was born. He was born on Dragonstone in the shadow of the Doom, surrounded by the history of a fallen empire. He was not a simple warrior. He was a student. He studied the maps of Westeros. He studied the lineages of its royal houses. He studied their wars, their defeats, their fears, and he saw what his ancestors had missed. He saw that the time for watching was over. A young Aegon Targaryen realized that the 7 kingdoms were ripe for unification. They were exhausted by centuries of conflict. Their kings were proud but short-sighted. Their armies were strong but divided. They had no common enemy. They had no common king. And they had no dragons. Aegon had 3. He gathered his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. He laid out his plans on the painted table. He looked west. The conquest was no longer a dream. It was a necessity. The last Valyrian was about to take what he believed was his, by right of fire and blood. This was the quiet beginning of the storm, a storm that would burn Harrenhal to ruin, shatter the armies of the Reach, and force the King of the North to his knees. A storm that would forge a single realm from the ashes of 7. The Aegonfort was not yet built. The Iron Throne was not yet forged. But the path was set. Aegon was ready, and his dragons were hungry. The doom of Valyria left House Targaryen completely alone, the only dragon lords left in all the world, isolated on a grim fortress island on the edge of Westeros. For nearly a century they fortified Dragonstone and looked east, toward the smoking ruin of their homeland. The halls of Dragonstone were carved from black stone, shaped by Valyrian sorcery, a permanent monument to the civilization they had lost. It was a place of fire, salt, and smoke, perpetually haunted by the memory of what was. The Targaryens married brother to sister, as was the custom of Valyria, to keep the blood of the dragon pure. They raised dragons from egg to beast, maintaining the ancient bond, but they did not conquer. They did not expand, they waited, surviving. But when Aegon Targaryen inherited the lordship of Dragonstone, he inherited that history of loss without succumbing to its paralysis. From the very beginning, there was a quiet, calculating ambition about him that set him entirely apart from his ancestors. Where they had looked back with grief and longing, Aegon looked forward with cold, patient scrutiny. He was a young man when he took his father's seat, but his eyes held the weight of a plan that would consume his entire life. He was not content to simply be the lord of a lonely island, the heir to a legacy of ash and memory. And there were always voices on Dragonstone, priests of the old Valyrian gods, exiles, merchants, and adventurers who whispered of reclaiming the freehold. The Valyrian peninsula still existed, a shattered landscape of demon roads and cursed stone, but some believed it could be rebuilt. They called for a fleet, for armies, for a return to the east to restore the empire of their ancestors. Aegon refused. He rejected every call to rebuild the Valyrian Empire in the east. He understood a fundamental truth that his kin could not see. The east was a graveyard. The future was not in the smoking ruins of a dead empire. It was in the fertile, divided, and unsuspecting continent to the west. His gaze turned permanently toward the Sunset Kingdoms. He began to study Westeros with the intensity of a scholar preparing for a great examination. But Aegon was far too shrewd to simply rely on maps drawn by merchants and sailors. He needed to see for himself. Rumors have persisted for centuries, whispered in the histories, and recorded in fragmentary accounts, that in the years before his conquest, Aegon Targaryen traveled through Westeros in secret. He took no dragon, no retinue, no banner. He walked its roads as a stranger, studied its great castles from the outside, sat in its inns, and listened to the talk of common men and lords alike. He learned the temper of the Northerners, the pride of the Stormlanders, the wealth of the Reach. It is impossible to confirm every detail of these journeys, but the flawless strategy of the war itself speaks to an intimate knowledge of the land that could not have been gathered from a library or a ship's deck. He knew precisely where to strike first, which harbours were defenceless, which rivers were navigable. He knew the rivalries he could exploit, the grudges that ran deep. He had mapped the terrain and assessed the strengths of every ruling house firsthand. Every king in Westeros was a stranger to him, but he knew them all. To crystallize this vision into something solid, something he could plan upon, Aegon ordered the construction of a truly remarkable object. Deep in the stone drum, the ancient keep of Dragonstone, his craftsman built the painted table. It was not a simple map. It was a massive wooden carving of Westeros, stretching across a great hall. Every river was etched into the wood. Every forest was painted in green. Every mountain range was raised from the surface. Master painters were brought in to render the coastlines with perfect accuracy. But Aegon himself oversaw the one detail that mattered most. The painted table showed no borders, no lines separating the Riverlands from the north, no boundaries between the Reach and the Stormlands or the West. The painted table was a map of a single, unified realm. It was Aegon's ambition made manifest, a vision of a continent united under one crown, a perfect representation of the world he intended to create, long before the first sword was drawn. The table stood waiting in the stone drum, a constant reminder of the task ahead. The intelligence of the Seven Kingdoms was locked in his mind. His sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys, were his partners in every sense, their own ambitions fully aligned with his own. Their dragons, Vhagar and Meraxes, had grown immense, alongside his own Balerion, a beast so colossal his shadow could darken an entire town. The quiet lord of Dragonstone had finished his preparations. The vision of a continent without borders, united under a single crown, was now a plan ready to be set in motion. Aegon Targaryen had made his decision. His gaze had turned west, and he would not, could not, look back. On Dragonstone, the painted table was complete, and in the year before the first of the new calendar, Aegon Targaryen began to move. The painted table, in the stone drum of Dragonstone, was a map of an entire continent. Aegon Targaryen would spend long hours standing over it, tracing the Riverlands and the mountain passes, calculating the distances between castles. But the maps showed him only territory. The true strength for what he was about to attempt was not on parchment. It was sitting in the dragon pit on the island, and it was sleeping in the chambers of the fortress itself. Aegon the Conqueror had made his choice to look west, but his power did not rest in his hands alone. To understand the invasion of Westeros, you must first understand the alliance that made it possible, an alliance forged in a direct violation of the old ways of the Valyrian freehold. Aegon defies Valyrian custom by marrying both of his sisters, Visenya and Rhaenys. In the high days of Valyria, polygamy was practiced among the dragon lords, but it was rare, and it was often a source of bitter feuds. By replicating this ancient custom, Aegon was not just holding on to tradition, he was securing a complex triumvirate of power. He eliminated the greatest threat to any dynasty, civil war among the heirs. He bound the two other dragon lords in the entire world to himself, in the most intimate bond possible. The three of them would rise together, or they would burn together. There would be no dividing their family against itself. The sisters who stood beside him were as different as fire and shadow, and the dragons they claimed reflected their natures with uncanny precision. Visenya was the elder. She was stern and martial to her core. She wore mail and leather as easily as silk. She trained with the sword in the yard and carried the legendary Valyrian steel blade, Dark Sister, a weapon designed for a woman's hand, but deadly in any grip. There was a severity to her, a hardness that never quite softened. It was often said in the later years that she knew the dark arts, that she kept poisons and potions, though this was never proven. What is proven is that she claimed the formidable dragon Vhagar. Vhagar was a beast of older, harsher stock, smaller than Balerion, but faster, meaner, and more aggressive. Vhagar breathed fire that could melt the stones of Harrenhal. Visenya and Vhagar were the left hand of the Conquest, the iron fist, the discipline, the unwavering threat of force. Rhaenys was the younger sister, and she was the opposite in almost every way. She was artistic and playful, charming and bright. She loved poetry and music. She was the one who smiled at the courtiers, who the small folk would later remember with genuine fondness. Where Visenya intimidated, Rhaenys persuaded. This softness, however, belied a core of steel. She bonded with the swift Meraxes. Meraxes was a dragon of incredible speed and grace, with golden scales and a roar that sounded almost like song. Meraxes was the diplomat of the trio, but a diplomat who could devastate an army from the sky in minutes. Rhaenys and Meraxes were the right hand of the Conquest, the velvet glove, the promise of mercy, the hope that surrender was better than annihilation. And then there was Aegon himself, the center of the wheel. He did not display the hardness of Visenya or the charm of Rhaenys. He was quiet, calculating. He thought before he spoke, and the dragon he rode was the living symbol of that implacable, silent power, Balerion, the Black Dread. Balerion was the largest and most terrifying living creature in the known world. Capable of swallowing a mammoth whole, his fire was said to be as hot as the furnaces of Valyria itself. The history of the Black Dread is almost lost to legend, but what is known is that when he flew, his shadow could plunge entire towns into a false twilight. No castle walls were thick enough to withstand him. No army was brave enough to hold formation against him. Aegon had claimed this monster, and the bond between them was the bedrock upon which an entire kingdom was built. This is the factor that military historians often focus on when analyzing the conquest: the dragons. They are the great equalizer. Together, the three siblings form a military and political alliance that offsets their lack of a massive standing army. The numbers are stark. When Aegon finally launched his invasion from Dragonstone, he landed with fewer than 600 men. The army of the Reach alone could muster 10 times that number. The Iron Fleet blockaded the rivers. How could a foreign house from a small island hope to conquer an entire continent? The answer was the alliance of the three dragons. Visenya, Rhaenys, and Aegon were not just a family. They were a general staff, an air force, and a royal dynasty rolled into three people. They did not need a massive army because they had achieved total military dominance before a single sword was drawn. The threat of facing Bar and Meraxes together was enough to make the most battle-hardened lord consider surrender. The alliance meant that no single kingdom could face all three dragons at once. The unity of the family was the machine that made the conquest possible. With this compact sealed, with the dragons fed and restive on Dragonstone, Aegon looked westward. The choice had been made. The family was united. The only question that remained was which of the seven kingdoms would be the first to feel the shadow of the Black Dread. The answer would come quickly, emerging from the Riverlands, from the cursed black towers of Harrenhal, where the Ironborn king, Harren the Black, laughed at the rumors of dragons and refused to kneel. With the essential bonds of dragon and rider secured, the trinity of House Targaryen was complete. Aegon now possessed the instruments of his ambition. But an ambition needs a target, and a target requires understanding. It was this understanding that brought him to the painted table. In the great hall of Dragonstone, carved from a single colossal slab of wood, lay a map unlike any other. The painted table depicted the entire continent of Westeros in exacting detail. Every river was carved into its surface, from the Trident to the Mander. Every mountain range, every forest, every castle of note was carefully marked and painted in vivid colors. It was a record of the known world, and Aegon stood before it to analyze the volatile rivalries between the seven independent kingdoms. He studied the map, not as a collector of curiosities, but as a strategist. The Ironborn dominated the Riverlands, their longships reaching up every river, their grip an iron fist around the heart of the continent. Harren the Black was building the largest castle the world had ever seen at Harrenhal, a monument to fear and pride. But his kingdom was brittle, held together by violence alone. To the south, the arrogant Storm King, Argilac Durandon, faced pressure from all sides. His lineage was ancient, his pride immense, but his borders were bleeding. The Dornish raided his southern marches. The lords of the Reach coveted his western lands. He was surrounded by enemies, a proud king standing atop a very narrow hill. As Aegon traced the borders, he saw the pattern clearly. The constant warfare between these kingdoms left them exhausted. They bled each other dry over petty feuds and ancient grudges, blind to anything beyond their own borders. And in that blindness, Aegon realized the truth. The constant warfare made them vulnerable to a sudden, overwhelming external threat. They had no unity, no warning system, no capacity to stand together against a common enemy. They were, in short, ready to fall. The decision was made quietly in that room, between the three of them. This would be no raid for treasure. It would not be a petty war for a single castle or a disputed river. The decision was made to launch an invasion, not to plunder, but to conquer and rule the entire continent under a single crown. Aegon looked at the painted table and saw not 7 kingdoms, but 1 kingdom, waiting to be formed. And so, the Lord of Dragonstone turned away from the table and began to gather his strength. Forces were summoned, a fleet was prepared, a landing site was chosen at the mouth of the Blackwater rush. On the painted table, it was just an empty stretch of coast, a point where a river met the sea. But it was here that the first stone of a new order would be laid. A simple motte and bailey castle was raised on that spot, the Aegonfort. It was not a declaration of war. It was a statement of permanence. The dragon had landed, and it had no intention of leaving. The first step toward a unified realm had been taken, and the maps of Westeros were about to be redrawn entirely. From this modest stronghold, Aegon sent forth his ravens to every corner of the continent. To the great lords, the minor barons, and the self-proclaimed kings, the message was identical. There would be only one king in Westeros. Those who bent the knee would retain their lands, titles, and honors. Those who took up arms against him would be utterly destroyed. It was a bold ultimatum from a man with fewer than 3,000 soldiers, but Aegon did not count his strength in men alone. He had dragons, and the lords of Westeros were about to learn the true cost of defying them. The response was a mixture of mockery, defiance, and fear. In the south, King Argilac of the Stormlands began to gather his hosts, refusing to yield to a foreign upstart. In the west, King Loren of the Rock and King Mern of the Reach began to negotiate an alliance, realizing that their ancient rivalry had to be set aside to face this new threat. But closer to the Aegonfort, the threat was immediate. The nearby castles of Rosby and Stokeworth surrendered almost immediately when the shadow of Vhagar and Meraxes fell over their towers. They chose survival over pride, a decision that would preserve their lineages for centuries. However, not everyone was so easily cowed. Lord Darklyn of Duskendale and Lord Mooton of Maidenpool joined their forces, marching south with 3,000 men to drive the Targaryens back into the sea. Aegon did not wait behind his wooden walls. He met them on the field, riding Balerion the Black Dread, while his half-brother Orys Baratheon led the ground forces. The battle was brief and devastating. The dragon's fire turned the vanguard to ash, and the surviving lords were forced to yield. Aegon accepted their oaths of fealty, returned their lands, and made them his vassals. He proved that he was not a mindless destroyer, but a ruler who valued loyalty above all else. With his immediate surroundings secured, Aegon held his coronation. It was not a grand ceremony in a cathedral, but a military display at the Aegonfort. Before his soldiers, his sisters, and the newly surrendered lords, Queen Visenya placed a circlet of Valyrian steel, set with large square-cut rubies, upon his head. Queen Rhaenys hailed him as the first of his name, King of all Westeros, and Shield of his people. The banner of the red three-headed dragon on a black field was unfurled for the very first time, symbolizing the unity of the three siblings and their monstrous beasts. The coronation was a declaration to the entire world that the old order was dead, but a crown on a head does not make a king of a continent. The true war was just beginning. Aegon divided his forces to strike at the heart of the divided kingdoms. Orys, Baratheon and Rhaenys were sent south to deal with the Storm King. Visenya was dispatched to the Vale to secure the east. Aegon himself turned his eyes toward the northwest, where Harren the Black ruled the Riverlands from the massive dark towers of Harrenhal. The conquest had begun, and the skies of Westeros would soon burn with dragonfire. The painted table was a record of debts, grudges and opportunities. Looking at it from Dragonstone, you could see the full weight of old Argilac's predicament. The Riverlands had been stripped from him. The Ironborn chewed at his borders from the west. He needed an ally, and he needed one fast. So he sent an envoy to Aegon. The offer was simple: his daughter Argella for an alliance. The dowry was the lands east of the God's Eye, land that already flew the black gold of House Hoare. Argilac was offering a war he couldn't win, paid for with the prize he no longer held. Aegon looked at the map. He understood Argilac's desperation. He offered a counter-proposal. He could not take Argella himself, but he offered his half-brother, Orys Baratheon, a bastard but a commander of immense skill. In the eyes of Dragonstone, this was a bond of equals. Orys was not a lesser man. He was the closest man Aegon trusted, but to the blood of the Storm King, a bastard was a stain on the marriage bed. Argilac did not see an alliance. He saw an insult, a deliberate demotion of his daughter and his kingdom. And so Argilac made the error that doomed his kingdom. He did not refuse the offer with a letter. He refused it with steel. He had the hands of Aegon's envoy severed and returned to Dragonstone. The message was blunt and vicious. These are the only hands you will get from the Stormlands. It was the act of a king who valued his pride over his survival. Aegon received the message. He did not call for war in a fit of rage. He simply moved to the next phase of his plan. He sent ravens to every lord in Westeros. There was no negotiation, no second offer. He declared himself the one true king of all the continent. Argilac's insult had removed the last barrier to absolute action. The lords could bend the knee, or they could burn. In a single stroke, the war was defined. It was not a war of succession or a war of liberation. It was a war of unification. Aegon was not claiming the Stormlands. He was claiming everything. The painted table had shown him the whole continent. Now he was reaching out to take it. Argilac prepared for a siege. He expected the attack to come straight at Storm's End. But Aegon was not fighting like a Westerosi lord. He was fighting like a dragon. He sent Orys Baratheon and part of his host to the Blackwater rush. He kept the full might of the dragons in reserve. The first move was not to destroy the Storm King. It was to establish a foothold on the continent itself. The Aegonfort was raised. King's Landing was not yet a city, but it was a claim made of stone and mud, and from that camp the summons were sent. The war for the Seven Kingdoms was officially underway. With the Aegonfort secured, the Conqueror divided his forces. He could not afford to strike in only one direction, while his enemies gathered their strength. Aegon himself turned his eyes north, toward the monstrous towers of Harrenhal, where Harren the Black ruled with an iron fist. But the threat of the Storm King could not be ignored. To deal with Argilac, Aegon sent his hand and half-brother, Orys Baratheon, marching south. Beside Orys rode Queen Rhaenys, mounted upon the golden-eyed dragon, Meraxes. The journey south was a nightmare of mud and blood. The lords of the Stormlands were fierce and loyal to their ancient king. They harassed Orys's vanguard, launching sudden raids from the dense tree line of the Kingswood, but they had no answer for the shadow in the clouds. Whenever the Stormlanders gathered in force, Rhaenys and Meraxes would descend, turning the forest into a roaring furnace. The march pressed on, drawing closer and closer to the formidable walls of Storm's End. Argilac the Arrogant watched the approach of this host from his high seat. He was an old warrior, but his spirit had not dimmed. He had heard whispers of what happened to Harrenhal. He knew that even the thickest stone walls of his ancestral seat, built to withstand the fury of the sea gods, could not protect his people from the dragon's breath. He refused to burn inside his own castle like a rat in a trap. He would meet his enemies in the open field, where a warrior's steel still held meaning. As the two armies drew near, the heavens opened. A torrential downpour lashed the earth, turning the battlefield into a swamp of thick, clinging mud. It was a storm worthy of the Storm King. Argilac saw his opportunity. The heavy rain and howling winds kept Meraxes grounded, unable to take flight and rainfire from above. With a roar of defiance, the Stormlanders charged, their heavy cavalry slamming into Orys's lines with the force of a tidal wave. The battle was a brutal, chaotic slaughter. Orys's vanguard was shattered, and for a moment, it seemed as though Argilac's gamble would pay off. But the bastard of Dragonstone would not yield. He rallied his men on a muddy ridge, holding the line against impossible odds. In the midst of the carnage, the two commanders found each other. Argilac, ancient but formidable, traded blows with the young, fierce Orys Baratheon. They fought on foot, slipping in the mud, surrounded by the dead and the dying. It was Orys who struck the final blow, cutting down the last of the Storm Kings and ending an era that had lasted for thousands of years. With Argilac dead, the remaining Stormlords broke and fled. Orys marched victorious to the gates of Storm's End. Argella, the proud daughter of the fallen king, barred the gates and declared she would die before she surrendered. But her own garrison, terrified of the dragon that sat perched upon the hills, betrayed her. They delivered her to Orys, bound and naked, hoping to buy their own lives. Orys, showing the nobility that Aegon had always seen in him, wrapped her in his own cloak, treated her with the utmost honour, and took her as his wife. He adopted the stag of the Storm Kings, their black and gold colours, and their words, "Ours is the fury." House Baratheon was born from the ashes of the old world, a testament to Aegon's new order. The insult to Argilac the Arrogant was a deliberate provocation from Aegon, but the Storm King's response was equally predictable. He had the hands of Aegon's envoys severed and sent them back to Dragonstone with a brutal message. Argilac expected an invasion of the Stormlands in return. Instead, Aegon vanished. The world held its breath, watching the narrow sea for the Targaryen fleet. But Aegon did not sail south. He did not answer Argilac's rage directly. He did something far more unexpected. In the year 2 before the Conquest, Aegon and his sister wives landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with a meagre force of fewer than 1,600 men. It was not an army that could challenge the great hosts of the continent. It was a declaration, a claim, an invasion launched not with overwhelming numbers, but with overwhelming purpose. The local lords, Rosby and Stokeworth, were the first to face the reality of what had arrived on their shores. They rode out with their banners raised, fully intending to demand the retreat of this foreign host. Then they saw them. Balerion, the Black Dread, his wings spreading across the sky like a storm front, the heat of his body distorting the air around him, and Vargar, the she-dragon of Visenya, nearly as vast, her scales scarred by time and battle. The local lords, Rosby and Stokeworth, surrendered quickly after witnessing the terrifying size of Balerion and Vargar. They did not draw a single sword. They dismounted, knelt in the mud of their own fields, and swore their oaths to the Dragon Lord from the east. They became the first Targaryen bannermen in Westeros, confirmed in their lands for their pragmatism. The initial landing was met with skepticism by the great kings of Westeros, who viewed Aegon as a minor warlord destined for failure. To understand this reaction, you must understand the age. The great houses had stood for thousands of years. They had seen petty kings and foreign adventurers rise and fall across the narrow sea. Harren the Black, deep in the construction of his colossal fortress of Harrenhal, heard the news and dismissed Aegon as a pirate prince with 3 scaly pets. His walls were thick enough to withstand any flame. Argilac the Arrogant seethed with the insult of the bastard Orys Baratheon, and he believed Aegon was a coward, hiding behind the skirts of the River Lords. In the Reach, King Mern the Gardener and King Loren of the Rock watched with cold calculation. They saw a foreigner fighting for a patch of disputed bogland. They assumed he would be crushed by Harren or Argilac. The whispers of a Dragon Lord were a distant rumour, not a pressing threat. They did not yet understand that Aegon did not want tribute. He did not want a kingdom. He wanted everything. While the kings of Westeros underestimated him, Aegon moved with purpose. He did not merely hold the shore, he began building. Aegon began constructing a crude wooden fortress, the Aegonfort, on the highest hill overlooking the bay. It was a simple motte and bailey, a quick earthen mound topped with timber walls, humble compared to the granite fortresses of the great lords, but it sat on that high ground, commanding a view of the river and the sea. It was not meant to be a masterpiece of stone. It was a foothold. It was a stake driven into the earth of Westeros. From this crude wooden fort, King's Landing would one day spread its walls across the 3 hills, becoming the largest city in the 7 kingdoms. But in those early days, it was nothing more than a claim. The Blackwater Rush was a strategic artery. Behind it lay the disputed lands of the River Kingdoms, the crown of the continent. By landing here, Aegon placed himself directly between the Iron Islands, the Stormlands, and the Reach. He forced his enemies to come to him, and when they came, they would have to face the dragons on ground of his choosing. But now Aegon consolidated. He drilled his men. He learned the land. He waited. The news of Rosby and Stokeworth's submission spread, and other minor lords began to cautiously offer their own oaths. But the peace would not last. The powers of the Trident and the Iron Islands could not ignore a new king being crowned in their backyard. Harren the Black had spent a lifetime bending the Riverlands to his will, and he would not suffer a rival. The foundation of the Conquest had been laid, the challenge had been issued, and across the Riverlands, the whispers of rebellion against the Iron Yoke began to stir, looking toward the smoke rising from the Blackwater. The dragons had come, and the first true test of Aegon's ambition now loomed directly ahead, waiting behind the monstrous black walls of Harrenhal. The surrender of Lords Rosby and Stokeworth was swift, almost anticlimactic after the months of anxious preparation. But Aegon Targaryen understood that a single landing does not make a conquest, and a handful of local oaths does not make a kingdom. The pinnacle of his ambition, the forging of a single realm united under a single throne, lay far beyond the horizon. The work of empire does not begin with a single battle, but with the first stone laid, the first stake driven deep into the earth. And at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, on the highest of the 3 hills that would one day define a capital city, that work now began in earnest. The first structure raised was not a palace of stone and marble. It was a raw utilitarian fortress of packed earth and timber, a classic Mott and Bailey design, built for speed and for defence, not for beauty. It was a military headquarters, a stronghold from which the Targaryen host could project power into the heart of the continent. This was the Aegonfort. It was an unassuming beginning for what would become the greatest city in all of Westeros. But in that moment, it was everything. It was the first permanent foothold of the Targaryen dynasty on the mainland, and the symbolic birthplace of a capital that did not yet have a name. Future generations would know it as King's Landing, but for now, it was simply the camp around the fort. The fort itself was the anchor, the proof that the invaders had not come to pillage and depart. They had come to stay. With the ramparts of the Aegonfort standing against the sky, the Targaryens paused to perform the rites of kingship. A sovereign without a crown is merely a warlord. Aegon needed the symbol of legitimacy. It was Visenya, ever the stern and commanding presence, who took up the ancient circlet, brought from the ruins of Valyria. It was a band of dark Valyrian steel, set with rubies that glowed like drops of fire in the afternoon sun. As she placed it upon Aegon's brow, she bound his authority to the dragon lords of old, to the blood of the freehold. Then Rhaenys, her voice carrying across the gathered host and the newly sworn lords, did something no one in Westeros had ever done. She hailed him not as the king of Dragonstone, not as the king of the Narrow Sea, but as the king of all Westeros. It was a breathtaking act of audacity. He sat upon a wooden throne, in a fort built by hand, at the head of an army of fewer than 1,600 men, and claimed dominion over a continent that had never bowed to a single ruler. The coronation was not a celebration of conquest completed. It was a declaration of war against every king, lord and freeholder who thought themselves independent. A king requires more than just a crown and a title. He requires a court, a system of governance, and trusted agents to execute his will. The Aegonfort was not just a barracks, it was the seed of a capital, and capitals need administrators. Aegon's first great act of state was to create the office that would become the cornerstone of royal governance. For 3 centuries, he summoned his bastard half-brother, Orys Baratheon, and appointed him the King's Hand. This was not a vague honorific. Orys was to be Aegon's chief general, his most trusted counsellor, and the ultimate executor of the king's commands. When Aegon took to the sky on Balerion, Orys would command the army on the ground. When Aegon declared law, Orys would ensure it was enacted. It was a partnership forged in blood and fire, and it established a model for the rule of the realm. The dragons were the weapon of last resort, the ultimate arbiter, but the day-to-day work of conquest and administration would fall to men like Orys Baratheon. The Targaryens established their first administrative offices within the wooden walls of the Aegonfort, drawing up writs, receiving sworn oaths, and organising the logistics of an ongoing war. They were building a state even as they were fighting for its very existence. Power attracts. The news of Aegon's arrival, his dragons, his crown, and his fort spread like wildfire through the Riverlands and beyond. The Aegonfort was a crossroads, and suddenly everyone was heading towards it. Camp followers arrived first. Cooks, washerwomen, smiths, and farriers, the vital but unglamorous support system of any medieval army. Then came the merchants. They saw an opportunity that could not be ignored. An army needs food, weapons, clothing, and leather. A king needs luxuries, fabrics, and finery. They set up stalls and shops at the base of the hill. Then came the labourers, the carpenters, the masons, the builders. They came for the wages and the protection of the fort. The population around the Aegonfort exploded. Tents became shacks. Shacks became row houses. The muddy paths became streets. The small settlement around the fort began to grow rapidly. It was a chaotic, crowded, and filthy place, the opposite of the orderly cities of the south. But it was alive. It was a testament to the gravitational pull of power. Aegon had come with fewer than 1,600 men. Now thousands were flocking to his banner, to his market, to his protection. The Aegonfort was no longer just a camp. It was the beating heart of a nascent kingdom. A kingdom that was still being carved out of fire and blood. But a capital is more than just a collection of buildings and people. A capital is a seat of will. From the Aegonfort, Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys now turned their gaze outward. The nearby lords had submitted. The foothold was secured. The dragon banner was planted. But the true lords of Westeros, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Gardeners, the Hoares, the Arryns, and the Durandons, they still held their thrones. They would not bend the knee simply because a crown had been placed on a foreign head. They had received the ravens from the Aegonfort, and they were making their own plans. The next phase of the history of the Seven Kingdoms would not be written by a single king on a wooden throne, but across the vast landscape of the continent itself. The circlet of Valyrian steel rested upon Aegon's brow, but a crown is not a kingdom. The Aegonfort was a statement of intent, yes, but it was still a wooden fortress surrounded by a continent that had not yet accepted its new king. The local lords, Rosby and Stokeworth, had bent the knee quickly, stunned by the sheer size of the dragons. But power in Westeros is a slow, grinding reflex. When the initial shock fades, pride and ambition rush back in to fill the void. It did not take long for that pride to organise into open defiance. House Darklin of Duskendale and House Mouton of Maidenpool were the true powers of this eastern seaboard. Their lands were ancient, their coffers deep, and their knights proud. They had watched the Targaryen landing with alarm, and they resolved to act before the invaders could become rooted. They formed a natural alliance, a bulwark against the Dragon Lord. Their goal was explicit: drive the Targaryen upstarts back into the narrow sea from whence they came. A formidable host was raised, a combined army meant to march on the Aegonfort and erase it from the banks of the Blackwater. But Aegon Targaryen had not fought his way across the ruins of Valyria to be cornered in his own camp. He understood that invasion relies on momentum. He refused to be besieged. Instead, he divided his forces to meet the threat on ground of his own choosing. He entrusted the command of his ground army to his half-brother, Orys Baratheon. Orys was a proven warrior, a man whose ambition burned as hot as dragonfire. While Orys led the Targaryen foot and horse north to intercept the enemy, Aegon took to the sky on Balerion, the Black Dread. He did not wait for the army to usher lightning on a battlefield. He did not wait for heralds or challenges. He took the war directly to the enemy, intercepting the allied army in the open countryside before it could reach its destination. What followed was not a battle in the traditional Westerosi sense. It was a single brutal lesson in the futility of the old ways. The combined might of the local lords was utterly shattered in a brief, fiery engagement. The Knights of Duskendale and Maidenpool had trained their entire lives for warfare by steel and sinew. They knew how to hold a shield wall, how to time a charge. They had no training for a creature the size of a fortress descending upon them from a clear blue sky. Balerion did not fight their army. he obliterated it. Ranks of men melted or scattered into chaos. Horses panicked and stampeded through their own supply lines. The careful formations of feudal warfare dissolved into a scattered rout before a single arrow was loosed. By the time Orys Baratheon arrived with his ground forces, he found an enemy completely broken in spirit formation. The work of the levies was simply to secure the surrender of those the dragon had spared. In those desperate hours, the lords of the Blackwater learned a truth that would echo across the continent for generations. There is no strategy, no wall, no army that can stand against a dragon. The age of conventional warfare was over. In the days that followed, the leaders of the defeated alliance faced a single stark choice: annihilation or submission. They chose life. House Darklin of Duskendale and House Mooten of Maidenpool bent the knee. They rode to the Aegonfort and swore their oaths to Aegon Targaryen. In doing so, they became his first major Westerosi vassals. These were not the minor keep lords of Rosby and Stokeworth, who had surrendered almost without a fight. The Darklins and Mootons were ancient houses with considerable influence, their names woven into the history of the Narrow Sea. Their willing submission sent an unmistakable signal throughout the southern kingdoms. The Targaryens were not mere reavers or pirates with exotic pets. They were a conquering dynasty, capable of absorbing existing power structures into a new, stable order. The integration of these houses was a masterstroke of governance. More critically, their fealty locked down Aegon's northern flank. The path into the heart of the Riverlands was now watched by sworn men. The Aegonfort, and the seed of what would become King's Landing, could never be taken by surprise from that direction. The foothold on the Blackwater was now an undeniable domain. The territory that would one day be known as the Crownlands was beginning to solidify around this new throne. But Aegon had not crossed the sea to rule a single bay and a handful of castles. The Painted Table was a constant reminder of the task ahead. To the west, the greatest fortress in Westeros awaited under the tyranny of Harren the Black. To the south, the proud Storm King nursed a rancorous fury at the insult of Aegon's terms. The first true test of the conquest was past, but the fires had only begun to spread. The Targaryen victory at Duskendale proved that the iron will of House Hoare could be bent, but it had not yet proven it could be broken. The heart of Harren's power did not lie on the coast. It lay inland, at the headwaters of the Trident, in a fortress built by slaves and paid for in blood. King Harren the Black had spent a lifetime constructing his defense against any army that might challenge him. But the enemy marching towards him now did not command an army. It commanded the sky. The Riverlands are a shattered country by nature. They have no natural borders, no mountains to hide behind. Invaders have marched through them forever. From the Andals to the Storm Kings to the Ironborn, the people of the rivers know how to bend. They know how to survive, but they also know when the time has come to snap. King Harren the Black, ruler of the Iron Islands and the Riverlands, watched the reports of Aegon's advance with growing unease. He had spent 40 years building Harrenhal, a monument to his own ego, a castle built on the backs of thousands of slaves who died before the first tower was finished. It was the largest castle ever constructed in Westeros. Its towers scraped the clouds. Its walls were thick enough to defy any siege engine ever devised. When the dragons first appeared in the east, he had laughed. Now, as his taxes dried up and his river lords began sharpening their swords in secret, he stopped laughing. He took the last of his loyal garrison, his sons, his captains, and he retreated into his fortress. It was the safest place in all the world. It had to be. Aegon marched into the Riverlands, and he did not find a nation loyal to its king. He found a tinderbox. The river lords had suffered under the Ironborn boot for 3 generations. They had seen their women taken, their crops burned, their fathers drowned as sacrifices to the drowned god. The moment Aegon's banners appeared on the horizon, a fire lit in their hearts. The first to step forward was Lord Edmund Tully of Riverrun. Edmund Tully gathered his swords, declared himself for Aegon, and in a single sweeping gesture that would define the future of his house for centuries, he bent the knee. He was the first major lord of Westeros to swear fealty to the dragon. It was the crack in the dam. News of Tully's rebellion spread like wildfire across the Riverlands. House Blackwood declared for Aegon. House Bracken, feuding with the Blackwoods for 1,000 years, declared on the same side, just to spite them. The Lannisters, the Freys, the Vance, they all abandoned the Ironborn king. It was not a river of blood that swept the Ironborn out, but a tide of long-suppressed loyalty, surging toward a new king. Harren the Black had built his empire on fear, but he had never built any loyalty. The moment a stronger power appeared, his kingdom dissolved before his eyes. Aegon, now with the strength of the Riverlands at his back, rode to the gates of Harrenhal. He sent a single herald under a banner of peace. The terms were surprisingly generous. Surrender, bend the knee, your sons will live. The Ironborn can keep their lands, their laws, their gods. Harren would simply trade his crown for a lord's coronet. It was a chance to live, a chance to end the Hoare dynasty not in fire and blood, but in peace. Harren listened to the offer from the highest tower in his castle. He looked down at the small figure of the herald, at the growing camp of river lords, and at the distant shape of the black dread in the sky. He thought Aegon was afraid to fight him, and so Harren the Black made the worst decision of his life. He refused. He stood on his battlements, his sons beside him, and he boasted. He told Aegon's messenger that his walls were massive stone, that they were the tallest towers in all of Westeros. The walls as thick as any castle in the Seven Kingdoms, that no fire, no dragon, no demon in the sky could melt them. He said, "My walls are strong. I am safe in here." He turned to his sons and laughed. "Let him come," he said. "Let him bring his lizards. They will break themselves against my walls, and I will hang their skulls from the gatehouse." The laughter that echoed through Harrenhal that day was the sound of a dynasty sealing its own tomb. The messenger rode back. Aegon listened to the answer. He did not argue. He did not shout. He simply mounted Balerion, his sisters taking to their own dragons, and rose into the darkening sky. Harren had trusted his walls. He had spent a lifetime believing that stone could turn aside anything, but he had never truly understood what he was dealing with. A dragon does not break your walls. It does not batter them down with the ram. It finds the cracks. It finds the windows. It finds the places where your fortress is strongest, and it pours fire into them until the stone itself sweats, cracks, and melts. The walls of Harrenhal had never been tested by a dragon. They were about to be. And when that fire fell from the sky, Harren the Black would finally understand the terrible truth he had just invited into his own hall. Harren the Black imagined his fortress would be a tomb for dragons. He was right about the tomb, but terribly wrong about the occupants. Harrenhal was a monstrosity of stone and arrogance. 5 towers so thick that a man could walk a mile around their base. The walls were meant to be invincible, a direct challenge to the power of the dragon. But Aegon did not look at the walls with the eyes of a general. He looked at them with the eyes of a predator, searching for the one weakness that Harren had never considered. As the sun sank behind the god's eye, staining the dark water the colour of rust and embers, Aegon mounted Balerion the Black Dread. He did not circle the castle, taunting its defenders. He rose. Higher and higher he climbed, the great black wings pulling against the cooling air of dusk. He flew Balerion high, above the reach of Harrenhal's archers as night fell over the lake. The archers on the battlements could only watch, their bows useless against an enemy who had already left the mortal realm behind. Harren stood on the highest tower, King's Pyre, roaring his defiance, daring the dragon to come closer. And the dread did come closer, but he came from a place no arrow could touch. When Aegon finally gave the command, Balerion opened his maw and the night turned to noon. It was not a flame. It was a torrent of black fire, a solid spear of heat that did not simply set things alight but erased them. Harrenhal was built from the largest blocks of fused stone in all of Westeros, stone that was supposed to withstand any siege. But this was not a siege. This was a judgment. The massive stone fortress heated until the towers melted like wax. The thick walls glowed orange, then white, then began to run. The stone flowed into the windows, sealing the doors, filling the corridors. Harren and his sons, who had mocked the strength of dragonfire from those very balconies just minutes before, found themselves trapped inside a furnace. They had nowhere to run. No stone could protect them. The entire line of House Hoare perished in a single night, their grand monument becoming their tomb. The horrific death of House Hoare sent shockwaves through Westeros. It was not just the loss of a king or the fall of a castle. It was the end of an era. Every lord who had ever relied on the thick stone of his keep had to reconsider the very foundations of his power. The myth of the impregnable stone castle was destroyed forever. Aegon had proven that no wall could withstand the will of the dragon. But Aegon was not just a destroyer, he was a builder, and he understood that fear alone was a brittle foundation for an empire. As he picked his way through the smouldering harem of Harrenhal, a castle that would stand forever cursed and blackened, he rewarded the man who had dared to rise against the Ironborn. He summoned Edmund Tully of Riverrun, the leader of the Riverlords who had rebelled when Aegon marched into their lands. Aegon named Edmund Tully as the Lord Paramount of the Trident, raising him above the other river houses and granting him dominion over the rivers that defined that ancient land. It was a masterful political stroke. By rewarding loyalty and establishing a new political order in the Riverlands, Aegon showed the other kingdoms exactly what submission could bring: power, legitimacy, and the favour of the Iron Throne. With the Riverlands secured and his western flank protected, Aegon could now turn his attention fully to the south. The surviving lords of the continent had seen Harren's fate, and they understood that hiding behind stone was no longer an option. The last great lines of resistance were forming, desperate men gathering armies on a scale that had never been seen before, believing that numbers might succeed where castles had failed. The war was about to escalate from the conquest of a kingdom to the annihilation of armies. In the fertile reach of the south, two kings watched the smoke rise from Harrenhal and realised that their only hope lay in unity. King Mern, the ninth of the Reach, ruler of the most populous and prosperous land in Westeros, rode north to join forces with King Loren I of Casterly Rock. Together, they forged the host of the two kings, an army of unprecedented scale. 55,000 men marched under their combined banners, a glittering forest of spears and swords, led by 5,000 armoured knights on heavy war horses. It was the greatest military force Westeros had ever seen, a golden host that seemed destined to sweep the Targaryen invaders back into the sea. Aegon, marching south with a force only a fraction of that size, did not retreat. Instead, he summoned his sisters, Rhaenys and Visenya. For the first and only time during the Conquest, all three Targaryen dragons, Valerian, Meraxes, and Vargar, would take to the skies together. When the two armies met on the wide, dry plains of the Reach, the coalition kings believed their victory was assured. They ordered a charge, their heavy cavalry thundering across the golden grass, confident that sheer numbers would crush the Targaryen line. But they had forgotten the lessons of Harrenhal. The dragons did not strike from the front. They came from above, riding the wind, and as they unleashed their fury, the dry grass caught fire. The wind whipped the flames into a wall of death, turning the battlefield into a roaring furnace. This was the Field of Fire. 4,000 men burned to death in the screaming chaos, including King Mern and all his heirs, bringing a sudden end to the ancient line of House Gardener. King Loren fled, only to bend the knee the following day, surrendering his crown and pledging the golden wealth of Casterly Rock to the Dragon King. In a single afternoon, the power of the South was broken, not by the clash of steel, but by the breath of beasts. With Harrenhal reduced to a smouldering husk and the Riverlands secured under a loyal Tully lord, the Targaryen war machine did not rest. The path ahead led south into a kingdom as fierce and enduring as its ancient name, the Stormlands. Aegon the Conqueror understood that the crown of Westeros could not be won by dragonfire alone. It required men who could lead on the ground, lords who could command loyalty and steel. For this task, he turned to the one man he trusted above all others, his rumoured bastard half-brother, Orys Baratheon. Orys Baratheon leads the Targaryen army south into the treacherous, rain-swept forests of the Stormlands. This was a different world from the sooty fields of the Riverlands. The Kingswood and the Rainwood were dense, primeval tangles of oak and ironwood, their branches weeping with moss and rain. The ground was uneven, riddled with roots and gullies that could break a horse's leg. Every step south was a fight against the land itself. The men of the Stormlands knew these woods, knew how to melt into them and strike from the shadows. Orys knew he could not blunder blindly into such a country. He needed eyes in the sky. Queen Rhaenys accompanies the army on Meraxes, scouting the enemy movements and burning the scouts of the Storm King. From her saddle high above the cloud layer, she guided the column, weaving through the peaks and valleys of the mountain ridges. Down below, the outriders of Argilac Durandon, the last Storm King, moved to harry the Targaryen flanks. They were the finest light cavalry in the south, men who had fought the Dornish for generations across the Boneway. But they could not hide from the Silver Dragon. Meraxes would descend through the mist, a flash of pale blue fire, and a patrol would simply vanish. The advance of the Targaryen army was marked by the sudden, unexplained silence of the Storm King's scouts. It was a creeping dread that spread before the army itself. Word of these events and the terrible fate of Harrenhal reached Argilac in his fortress of Storm's End. He was an old man by now, past 80, yet still broad-shouldered and fierce. He wore his grey hair like a crown. His lords urged him to seal the gates, to trust in the legendary walls of Storm's End, which were raised by Torrhen Godsgrief himself, and were said to stand against the fury of the sea and sky. But Argilac the Arrogant refused to be burned in his castle like a rat in a trap. He would not suffer the fate of Harren the Black. He called his banners and marched out to meet the invader in the open field, trusting in the swords of his men and the fury of the land he ruled. And it seemed the old gods of the Stormlands answered his call. A massive autumn storm rolls in off Shipbreaker Bay, the kind of storm that legends are made of. The wind did not just blow, it screamed. It tore tents from their stakes and threw men from their saddles. Rain fell in sheets so thick that a man could not see 5 feet in front of him. The sky turned black. Meraxes, the bronze and silver glory of Rhaenys, could barely hold her place in the sky. The storm grounded the dragon, dampening her fire and stealing the Targaryens their greatest advantage. For the first time in the Conquest, the Dragon Lords faced a battle without their terror from above. The Stormlanders saw this as a divine sign. They believed the gods themselves had levelled the field. They charged into the howling wind with a ferocity that matched the tempest. The battle that followed was a brutal, chaotic slog in the mud. Orys Baratheon commanded from the thick of the fighting, his warhammer sweeping the legs of horses and crushing the helms of knights. It was a warrior's brawl, fought without quarter and without mercy. Argilac himself led the van, an old lion in his final battle. He cut down 12 men before the tide of the River Lords and the Crownlanders surrounded him. History does not record the exact moment of his death, but it is said that Orys Baratheon met him in the press and struck him down. The Storm King fell in the rain, sword in hand as he had vowed. After the battle, the last holdout, Storm's End, surrendered when its garrison delivered Argilac's daughter, Argella, to Orys in chains. He broke those chains with his own hands, treated her with honour, and took her as his wife. He took the words of the fallen Durandons for his own. Ours is the fury. The Stormlands had fallen, and a new house was born in the fire and rain. The southern kingdoms had lost their eastern shield. The great alliance of the Reach and the Rock, led by the Gardeners and the Lannisters, now knew they had no choice but to face the dragon on the open field, with nothing left to hide behind. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. Orys Baratheon pushed his army south through the rain-swept heart of the Stormlands. Queen Rhaenys and Meraxes had already cleared the path of Argilac's scouts, burning them out of the forest whenever they were found. The Storm King knew they were coming. He had refused Aegon's offers of peace, mocking the idea of his daughter marrying a bastard. He would meet them on the field of his own choosing, determined to make the Targaryens pay for every mile of his kingdom. The final confrontation came at a place the singers would later call the Last Storm. As if the sky itself was mourning the end of an era, the battle began in a torrential downpour. Rain fell in blinding sheets, turning the ground into a deep, sucking mire. For a moment, it seemed the weather might level the playing field, grounding the Targaryen dragons and forcing a purely terrestrial fight. Argilac the Arrogant seized this chance. He led his heavy knights himself, thousands of armoured horsemen charging through the mud against Orys Baratheon's waiting lines. The sight of the Storm King's banners, the crowned stag, must have been a terrifying one as they emerged from the grey wall of rain, lance lowered, hooves churning the earth into a brown slurry. But Argilac had underestimated the sheer will of the Conqueror's sister wives. Queen Rhaenys had not retreated to safety because of a little water. She brought Meraxes low over the battlefield, and despite the sheeting rain, she unleashed bursts of dragonfire into the charging ranks. The wet ground hissed and steamed, but dragonfire burns hotter than any common flame. It washed over horses and men, not necessarily consuming them in flame, but panicking the animals beyond control. The tight, glorious charge of the Stormland Knights broke into chaos. Horses reared, threw their riders, and bolted into the mud. The cohesion of the attack was shattered in a matter of minutes. But even with the cavalry in disarray, Argilac the Arrogant would not yield. He could not. He was the Storm King, a man of the Durrandon line that had ruled these lands for centuries. He found Orys Baratheon amidst the chaos of the field. The two commanders met in single combat on the muddy battlefield. It was not a clean or chivalrous duel, but a brutal, savage contest of strength and desperation fought in ankle-deep mud. Orys, for all his reputation as Aegon's bastard brother and fiercest commander, was tested to his absolute limit. But in the end, he brought the old king down. He slayed Argilac the Arrogant there, in the rain, the blood of the Storm King, mingling with the brown water and black soil of his kingdom. With their king dead in the mud, the Stormland army collapsed. It took only a single afternoon. Centuries of proud Durrandon rule, wiped away by the shock of dragonfire and the loss of their leader. The backbone of the southern resistance was broken. The path south to Storm's End now lay open. Orys Baratheon had won his greatest victory. But for Aegon Targaryen, the conquest was far from over. With the Stormlands subdued, the focus of the war shifted. To the west lay the golden mines of the Lannisters. To the southwest, the vast, fertile armies of the Reach were mustering under the last of the gardeners. They had seen what happened at Harrenhal. They knew what dragons could do to stone and shadow, yet they chose to face them in the open field anyway. While the rain dried on the field of the last storm, the largest army the continent had seen in generations was assembling, carrying the banners of the Lion and the Green Hand, ready to make their stand. This grand alliance of the West and the Reach became known as the Host of the Two Kings. King Loren of the Rock and King Mern of the Reach marched side by side, commanding a force of 55,000 men, including over 5,000 armoured knights. It was an unstoppable iron tide, a force so massive that it outnumbered the Targaryen army 5-1. When Aegon received word of this massive gathering, he did not retreat or seek high ground. Instead, he flew to meet them, calling upon both of his sister wives, Rhaenys and Visenya, to join him. For the first time since the conquest began, all three dragons, Balerion the Black Dread, Vargar and Meraxes, would take to the sky together over a single battlefield. They met on the wide, dry plains of the Northern Reach. The grass was tall and golden, dried by the late summer heat. King Mern, confident in his numbers, led the charge from the centre, his golden rose banner fluttering in the wind. The earth shook under the hooves of thousands of charging horses. But Aegon did not fight a traditional battle. As the coalition army advanced, the 3 Targaryen siblings took to the air. They did not target the front lines. Instead, they flew behind the advancing army and unleashed their fire upon the dry, golden grass. The wind caught the flames, driving a wall of fire directly into the backs of the charging knights. The battlefield became a literal furnace, an inferno that would forever be remembered as the Field of Fire. Over 4,000 men burned to death that day, including King Mern and all his heirs, bringing an end to the ancient House of Gardner. King Loren managed to escape, but he was captured the following day and bent the knee, yielding the golden wealth of Casterly Rock to the Dragon Lords. The last storm was over. Argilac the Arrogant was dead. The field was a graveyard of mud and splintered steel. His army scattered his knights, either slain or fleeing for their lives. The battle had been a brutal, decisive victory for Aegon the Conqueror, but the war in the Stormlands was not yet finished. The storm's heart still beat. Up the coast, the grey, windowless cylinders of Storm's End rose against the sky, the ancient fortress of the Storm Kings having never fallen to assault in all its long history. And within its walls, Argilac's daughter prepared to make a final stand. Her name was Argella. She was the last of the Durandons, and she refused to accept the defeat of her father. As the remnants of the army streamed past the castle gates, she ordered them barred. She assembled the garrison in the Hall of the Kings and declared that Storm's End would never yield. They would defend it to the very last child within its walls. It was a speech of desperate courage, a proud and suicidal defiance in the face of an overwhelming power that had already melted Harrenhal and broken every army sent against it. Yet the men of her garrison did not share her fire. They had watched the battle from the towers. They had seen the black shadow of Meraxes descend out of the clouds, had seen columns of dragon flame wash over the knights of the Stormlands. They knew that Harren the Black and his sons had died screaming in their melted towers. They knew that the next dragon to arrive at Storm's End would not be an ally. The fear of the dragons was a tangible force, heavier than the stone of their own fortress. It broke their loyalty. That very night, while Argella prepared to die a queen, her own guard turned against her. They found her in her chambers. They seized her. They stripped her of her crown, her clothes, and her dignity. And then, in a final act of humiliation intended to curry favour with the victor, they delivered her to the camp of Orys Baratheon. Naked and bound, she was dragged before the general who had killed her father. A gift meant to appease the dragon. It was a moment that could have defined the entire conquest of the Stormlands as a senseless tragedy. But Orys Baratheon was not a man given to petty cruelty. He looked at the daughter of the Storm King, trembling and exposed before him, and saw not a prisoner to be mocked, but a powerful opportunity for legitimacy. He did not shame her. Instead, he cut her bonds himself. He removed his own cloak, heavy with the rain and mud of the campaign, and wrapped it around her shoulders, covering her nakedness. He treated her with an honour that her own men had failed to show her. And then, in a move that was as brilliant strategically as it was merciful, he took her as his wife. It was the ultimate seal of conquest. The blood of the Storm Kings would not be scattered or extinguished. It would be absorbed. The line of Durandon would continue, but under a new name. When Aegon the Conqueror arrived to receive the formal submission of the Stormlands, he recognised the wisdom of the Union. He granted Orys Baratheon the fortress of Storm's End. He granted him the ancient sigil of the Storm Kings, the crowned stag, as his own, and he granted him the title of Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, making him the first of the great lords to hold their power directly from the Iron Throne. The fall of the Stormlands was complete. House Durandon lived on, its golden stag stitched onto a field of black. The first and greatest of the new great houses had been formed. House Baratheon was born, destined to stand watch over the eastern shores of the realm for generations. And as Orys settled into his new seat, the political map of the south was set. Aegon now controlled the eastern seaboard. His flank was secure. The path was clear for the final phase of the war. To the west, the ancient powers of the Reach and the Rock had set aside their millennia of rivalry. They were gathering the largest army the continent had seen, marching to meet the dragon in an open field where the fate of the south would be decided by fire and blood. The news of the Stormlands surrender travelled faster than any raven could carry it. Argilac de Randon, the last of the Storm Kings, had been delivered to Orys Baratheon, bound and naked, her own garrison choosing submission over the Inferno. Orys was now Lord of Storm's End, a new house rising from the ashes of the old. But while the southeast burned, the Lords of the Reach and the Westerlands watched the sky with growing dread. They did not plan on kneeling as meekly as Argilac's guards. The war had changed. It was no longer a series of isolated sieges and skirmishes. The Dragon Lords were a direct threat to the sovereignty of every remaining independent kingdom, and the two most powerful of those kingdoms, the Reach and the Rock, understood that their only hope was to fight fire with steel. Not just any steel, but a wall of it. King Mern, the 9th of House Gardner, the King of the Reach, sent his swiftest ravens to his brother-in-law, King Loren, the 1st of the Rock. In a moment of stark clarity, two ancient enemies set aside generations of territorial rivalry. The Lion and the Rose joined together under a single desperate purpose: to crush the Targaryens before their shadow fell over every hall in Westeros. This was not merely an alliance of convenience. It was a grand coalition, and they named it the Host of the Two Kings. Their combined army was a spectacle, the likes of which Westeros had never seen. No previous conflict had demanded such a gathering of strength. Over 55,000 men took the field. 5,000 of them were armoured knights, clad head to hoof in plate and mail, mounted on destriers bred for the crushing weight of the charge. It was the largest force ever assembled on the continent. Lords from the Mander to the Sunset Sea brought their full strength. The gold of Casterly Rock paid for its weapons and its wages, and the fertile fields of the Reach fed its thousands of mouths. A train of supply wagons stretched for miles behind the columns of spearmen. This host was not just an army, it was the concentrated military will of two kingdoms refusing to die. Aegon, Visenya, and Rhaenys received the reports of this gathering in the Aegonfort. They looked upon their own muster, the forces that had conquered the Riverlands and the Stormlands, the River Lords under Edmund Tully, the Loyalists from the Crownlands, the Sellswords from the Narrow Sea. It was a strong army by any ordinary measure, deadly and experienced. But against the host of the two kings, the math was brutally simple. They were outnumbered more than 5 to 1 on the ground. Conventional pitched battle would mean annihilation. Aegon's strength had never truly been in the number of men he commanded, but in the shadow of his wings. He knew that marching his foot into the heart of the Reach to die on Lannister spears was not a strategy, it was suicide. His only path to victory was through the air. For the first time in the entire campaign, the 3 Targaryen siblings and their dragons were no longer scattered across the map. Visenya, who had been securing the Vale, flew Vagar south to join her brother. Rhaenys, fresh from her triumph over the Storm King, steered Meraxes to ground beside her sister. Aegon mounted Balerion. For the first time since the invasion began, the 3 great worms of House Targaryen took to the skies together, a living triad of fire and scale. It was a calculated risk. If they lost a single dragon, the entire campaign could collapse. But if they won here, they would shatter the backbone of the armed rebellion. They did not march their army forward. They flew. They headed directly for the plains of the Reach, where the two kings had assembled their great host. Let's stay with the two kings for a moment to understand their gamble. King Mern the 9th was old. His house had ruled the Reach for over 5,000 years, since the dawn of the first men. He could not imagine a world where the green hand of House Gardner knelt to a foreign dragon lord from a lost Valyrian colony. King Loren of the Rock was younger, old, surrounded by the unimaginable wealth of Casterly Rock. He saw the destruction of Harren the Black as a failure of nerve, not a failure of strategy. A single castle, baked while its king cowered inside. They were an army in the open field. Their knights could charge. Their archers could loose volleys by the thousand. A dragon was a creature of meat and blood. It could be brought down by a well-placed scorpion bolt, or simply by the sheer mass of iron and steel thrown into the sky. Their plan was sound on parchment. Force a pitched battle on ground of their choosing. Overwhelm the Targaryen foot with sheer numbers, and pray the dragons could be driven off or even killed. They had the numbers to test that theory. Over 55,000 men, 5,000 knights, the greatest host in the history of Westeros. The host of the two kings mustered near the banks of the Mander and began their march south. It was a beautiful, terrible sight, a river of steel and silk. Banners of House Gardner, the green hand of the Reach, flew beside the golden lion of House Lannister. The earth trembled under the synchronized step of their columns. They moved onto the open grasslands, confident in their steel, confident in their numbers. Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys saw them from miles away, their formations gleaming in the autumn sun. The three dragons began their descent. The wind carried the sound of war horns, a desperate, frantic call to organize the ranks for an aerial assault they had never truly trained for. A volley of arrows rose to meet them, a dark cloud of shafts that fell short or glanced harmlessly off dragon scale. Balerion came first, a black shadow that blotted out the sun itself. Vargar and Meraxes flanked him, their roars shaking the very air, a sound that stripped men of their courage. The knights tried to form a wedge to charge the open ground, but there was no enemy to charge. There was only fire, raining down from a sky that had become a furnace. The greatest army the continent had ever assembled did not break for a charge. It broke for the heat. The ground itself turned black, boiling the men inside their armor. The memory of that day was not of swords clashing against shields, but of screams swallowed by roaring flame. The fate of the Reach and the Rock would be written in the scorched earth of the field they had chosen for their stand. The alliance forged between the Rose and the Lion had raised the largest army the continent had ever seen. Over 55,000 men marched under the banners of the Reach and the Rock, a host so vast that its commanders believed no dragon could devour it whole. They marched south to meet the Targaryen host in the open field, confident that sheer mass would finally overwhelm the invader. The armies converged on a wide, dry plain in the heart of the Reach. A stretch of golden grass turned brittle by the summer heat. This was at the moment King Mern, the 9th of House Gardner, and King Loren, the 1st of House Lannister, had staked everything on. The allied army drew up its battle line across a front that stretched for leagues. The vanguard was made up of the finest heavy cavalry in the Seven Kingdoms. 5,000 armoured knights with lances levelled, their armour gleaming in the high summer sun. Behind them came the spearmen, the archers, the swordsmen, rank after rank of seasoned soldiers who had never tasted defeat on their own soil. Mern and Loren took their positions at the rear, watching the distant Targaryen banners flutter over a force that numbered barely a tenth of their own. That numerical confidence drove them to attack. The command was given, and the allied army charged across the dry grasslands of the Reach, confident that their overwhelming numbers would sweep the Targaryens away. The thunder of 55,000 boots and hoofs shook the earth. It must have sounded like the end of the world, but they were charging into a trap. The jaws of that trap were made of fire and leather and scales. From the Targaryen camp, 3 shapes rose into the sky. Aegon mounted Balerion, the Black Dread, the largest dragon the world had seen since the doom of Valyria. Visenya took to the skies on Vargar, the formidable she-dragon who had already proven her worth at Harrenhal, and Rhaenys soared on Meraxes, golden and swift. Aegon, Visenya and Rhaenys took to the skies simultaneously, unleashing a coordinated firestorm upon the dry grass. They did not aim for the men, they aimed for the ground beneath them. The fire did not strike the army in a single column. It fell in a massive crescent, hemming the Gardener and Lannister host in on 3 sides. The dry summer grass ignited instantly. The flames rose higher than any castle wall, consuming the air itself. Horses screamed and threw their riders. Ranks of knights dissolved into clouds of ash. Soldiers trapped in their armor began to cook alive before the flames even touched them. The charge became a stampede. The stampede became a slaughter. Over 5,000 men were burned alive in the inferno, and twice as many were horribly injured as the battlefield became an inescapable furnace. Men threw down their swords and ran, but there was nowhere to run. The smoke alone killed hundreds, choking them where they stood. The heat was so intense that swords bent and shields warped into useless shapes. The army that had sworn to crush the dragon was no longer an army, it was a fleeing mob, and the dragons hunted them across the burning plain. King Mern, the 9th of House Gardener, and all his heirs perished in the flames. The Gardeners had ruled the Reach since the Dawn Age, a lineage that stretched back thousands of years to Garth Greenhand himself. In a single afternoon of fire and chaos, that entire dynasty was erased from the world. Mern's crown, his sons, his brothers, his cousins, all consumed. The rose of the Reach withered in the inferno. King Loren I of the Rock managed to escape the field, though barely. He witnessed the ruin of the 2 kingdoms' power firsthand. Seeing the dragons circle overhead, the Golden Lion of the West made a choice that would define his legacy. He bent the knee. The Lannisters would survive. They surrendered their crown and accepted Aegon's authority, becoming the Wardens of the West in a new unified order. But the Reach was left without a ruler. The Gardener line was extinct. Aegon needed a steward to manage this fertile and populous land. He looked to the keepers of Highgarden, a capable man named Harlan Tyrell, who had wisely surrendered the castle rather than invite the dragon's wrath. By Aegon's decree, House Tyrell was raised to the lordship of the Reach, becoming the Wardens of the South. A house of stewards became a royal house through the simple act of knowing when to yield. The field of fire broke the back of organised military resistance in the south. With the Reach shattered and the West submitting, only a few obstacles remained before Aegon could claim the title of King of all Westeros. The conquest was no longer a question of if, but of when the last holdouts would fall into line. The road to the Iron Throne was paved with ash and scorched earth, and the Targaryens had proven, beyond any doubt, that the old kings of the continent would either bend or burn. When the flames finally died down, and the smoke drifted away from the field of fire, the Targaryens had won more than a battle. They had erased an entire kingdom's history. King Mern IX was dead. His sons were dead. His brothers, his uncles, his cousins. The entire inheritance of House Gardener was reduced to ash and bone. The dynasty that had ruled the Reach since before the Iron Throne was even a dream was simply gone. The destruction of House Gardener left the Reach leaderless and in complete disarray. Aegon did not pause. He did not wait for the surviving Reach lords to gather their wits in some desperate council. He simply mounted Balerion and marched his host directly south, down the Rosa Road, making straight for Highgarden, the ancestral seat of the Gardeners. He fully expected a siege. He expected every loyal lord to have rallied behind those ancient walls for a final, desperate stand. But when Aegon arrived at the gates of Highgarden, he found no army. He found the gates standing open. Riding out to meet him was not a lord or a knight, but the castle's steward, a man named Harlan Tyrell. The Tyrells had been the stewards of Highgarden for generations. They were the administrators, the loyal servants of the Gardener household. They were not warriors, but in this moment, Harlan Tyrell understood the reality of the situation better than any king ever had. He looked at the 3 dragons circling overhead. He looked at the vast army at the gates. He knew the Gardeners were dead, and he made a choice born of pure, clear wisdom. He opened the gates. He surrendered Highgarden to Aegon the Conqueror without shedding a single drop of blood. Aegon was a dragon lord, but he was also a statesman. He knew the immense value of peaceful submission. He knew that loyalty earned freely was worth more than 1,000 castles burned to the ground. And so, in gratitude for this peaceful submission, Aegon elevated House Tyrell to Lords Paramount of the Mandor and Wardens of the South. The steward was made a lord. House Tyrell would now rule the Reach in the name of the Iron Throne. The Reach had submitted. The lesson was starkly clear for all of Westeros. To resist the dragons was to die. To bend the knee was to rise. The other kings had watched this lesson unfold. Loren Lannister had survived the Field of Fire, but he had watched his entire army burn to death around him. He knew that Casterly Rock, for all its legendary defences and gold, could not hold against 3 dragons. He was racing home, not to prepare for a siege, but to choose the exact moment of his submission. The Western armies were in full retreat. The richest man in Westeros was about to make the hardest decision of his life. When Loren Lannister finally met Aegon, he did not offer battle. Instead, the King of the Rock knelt in the dirt, offering his crown and his sword to the Conqueror. Aegon, true to his policy of mercy for those who submitted, raised the fallen king to his feet. He returned Loren's sword and confirmed him in all his lands and lordships, naming him the Warden of the West. Casterly Rock remained in Lannister hands, but its lords would henceforth answer to the Iron Throne. With the West and the South secured, Aegon turned his eyes to the north. King Torrhen Stark had marched down from Winterfell with an army of 30,000 fierce Northmen, determined to defend his ancient kingdom from the foreign invader. They crossed the Neck and marched into the Riverlands, where they found Aegon waiting for them. But Aegon did not face them with a small force. Word of his victories had spread, and lords from the Reach, the Stormlands, and the Riverlands had flocked to his banners. Beside his 3 dragons, Aegon now commanded a host of over 45,000 men. Torrhen Stark looked across the Trident and saw the massed armies of the South. He saw the 3 great beasts circling in the sky above. He remembered the stories of the Field of Fire and the melted ruins of Harrenhal. He knew that to fight was to condemn his people to a fiery death. Some of his fiercer lords urged him to attack, promising that northern valor would carry the day. Others suggested a stealthy assassination attempt, sending Torrhen's bastard brother, Brandon Snow, across the river under the cover of darkness to slay the sleeping dragons. But Torrhen Stark was a wise king who cared more for the lives of his subjects than his own pride. He chose a different path. He sent Brandon Snow across the Trident, not with a blade, but with 3 maesters to negotiate terms of surrender. The next morning, Torrhen himself crossed the river. In the sight of both armies, the king in the north knelt before Aegon Targaryen, laid his ancient crown at the Conqueror's feet, and swore fealty. From that day forward, he would be known as the King Who Knelt. But his people returned to their homes unharmed, their lives and their castles spared. Aegon named Torrhen the Warden of the North, and House Stark maintained its ancient rule over the cold lands of the Winter Kings. For King Loren Lannister, the screams of the Field of Fire did not fade with distance. They echoed in his ears with every mile his horse carried him away from the carnage. He had escaped the inferno that had claimed King Mern the Ninth and the entire line of Gardner. But he was under no illusions. The legend of the dragons had been made flesh before his very eyes, and the flesh had burned. His army, the proud host of the Rock, had scattered into the hills. His golden armour was still blackened with soot. His crown felt heavier than it ever had, not because of the gold it was forged from, but because of the weight of a kingdom that was no longer his to hold. Loren knew Casterly Rock was impregnable by conventional means. It was a fortress carved from a mountain, its gates unimaginable, its mines stretching deep into the earth. But the Rock had never faced a dragon. Valerian could turn the stone, Casterly, into a furnace. And even if the Rock could hold, what of Lannisport, the golden city at its feet? What of his people? Reflecting on the charred field behind him, Loren understood that further resistance was not courage. It was suicide. It was the extinction of his entire line. the same fate that had befallen the gardeners. He could not win this war. The only question that remained was how he would end it. The decision made, Loren Lannister did not send a raven. He did not send a lord in his place. He went himself. He rode into the Targaryen encampment outside Highgarden, dismounted before the assembled host, and walked forward alone. In the presence of Aegon the Conqueror, flanked by his queens and the shadows of their dragons, the King of the Rock knelt. He removed his golden crown and placed it on the ground. He offered his sword hilt first, with the clear, sober voice of a man who had accepted the only future left to him. Loren Lannister swore an oath of eternal fealty to the Targaryen dynasty. Aegon looked down at the kneeling king. He could have executed him. Many conquerors would have. The field of fire was still fresh in everyone's memory. But Aegon was not building an empire of ashes. He was building a realm. He took the crown from the ground and placed it back on Loren's head. The King of the Rock was no more. In that moment, Loren Lannister became the Lord of Casterly Rock and the Warden of the West. Sworn directly to the Iron Throne, his lands were restored. His titles, save for the crown, were confirmed. This peaceful transition of power was a masterstroke. It demonstrated to every lord in the realm that Aegon was willing to govern through the existing nobility, not simply replace them. The West was not sacked. Lannisport did not burn. The Lannister gold, the greatest source of wealth in the entire continent, remained in the hands of the family who knew best how to manage it. In return, the Lannisters became the most powerful of the new Targaryen loyalists, their fate now forever tied to the dynasty that had spared them. The speed and completeness of Loren's surrender sent a powerful ripple across the remaining independent kingdoms. The great southern coalition had shattered. The West had bent the knee without a single stone thrown in defiance. Only the North and the Vale remained, their kings watching from their distant fortresses. But a lord from the north, a man named Torrhen Stark, was already leading his fierce army south. He had heard the tales of Harrenhal. He had absorbed the reports of the Field of Fire. Now he heard that the King of the Rock had bowed. The weight of choice pressed upon him, just as it had pressed upon Loren Lannister in the smoke of his defeat. The dragons were coming, and the North would have to decide what truth it was willing to face. Torrhen Stark marched south with 30,000 Northmen, a fierce and proud host that had never known the rule of a southern king. They crossed the neck, ready to defend their ancient independence with steel and blood. But as they reached the banks of the Trident, the reality of the threat became undeniable. Across the river, a force, more than 1.5 times the size of Torrhen's army, Aegon had assembled the hosts of the Reach, the Riverlands and the West, and hovering in the skies above them were the 3 great beasts that had rewritten the laws of war. For a day and a night, the two armies stared at each other across the rushing waters. Torrhen's lords urged him to attack. His half-brother, Brandon Snow, even offered to cross the river under the cover of darkness to assassinate the sleeping dragons. But Torrhen was a king who ruled with his head, not his pride. He knew that the courage of the North would not protect his men from dragonfire. He knew that if he fought, the fields of the Trident would run red with the blood of an entire generation of Northmen, and Winterfell would become nothing more than a monument of ash. When the sun rose, Torrhen Stark crossed the Trident. He did not carry a sword. He walked into Aegon's camp, knelt before the Conqueror, and laid the ancient bronze and iron crown of winter at Aegon's feet. In that moment, he surrendered his crown to save his people. He arose as the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. Though some in the North would forever call him the King who knelt, his surrender was a victory of wisdom over vanity. The North was spared the fire, its ancient customs left intact, and its people secure in their homes. With the North secured, Aegon's gaze turned to the final holdouts. But the message was now clear to all of Westeros. The old world was gone, and a new empire had risen from its ashes. Loren Lannister had knelt, the lion was caged, the West was won. But Aegon knew the true depths of winter loomed to the north. A kingdom of ice and iron, that had never bowed to a southern king. The intelligence gathered by his sisters painted a clear picture. The King of Winter, Torrhen Stark, was mustering his strength. Torrhen Stark was not a man to be cowed by rumour. He had heard of the Field of Fire, of Harrenhal, but the north was not the reach. It was a land of vast distances and brutal winters. He believed that his 30,000 hardened spears, men forged in a lifetime of fighting the cold and the wildling raiders, could stand against any army from the south. He marched south of the Neck, determined to defend the sovereignty of the north, its ancient independence forged in the Age of Heroes. The two hosts finally met on the banks of the Trident. It was a stark contrast. The northern host of 30,000 faced a Targaryen army that had swelled to 45,000 fresh and loyal men, drawn from the Riverlands, the Stormlands, and the recently subdued West. And above the Targaryen camp, the three dragons stirred: Balerion, the Black Dread, Vargar, Meraxes. They were a living cataclysm waiting to be unleashed. Inside Torrhen's tent, the council of war was heated. His lords and bannermen urged him to attack. They argued for a night assault, for guerrilla warfare in the bogs. Brandon Snow, the king's bastard brother, offered to cross the river alone, under cover of darkness, to slay the beasts while they slept. It was a bold plan, spoken with northern pride and desperation, but Torrhen Stark had heard the accounts of the surrender of Harrenhal firsthand. He had listened to the merchants and the refugees, who described how stone itself had twisted and wept under dragonfire. He looked across the river and he understood. The sight of the melted ruins of Harrenhal, hidden beyond the horizon, but present in the knowledge of every man, combined with the sheer overwhelming power of the assembled Targaryen host, convinced him otherwise. Defiance meant extinction. The north would become a wasteland, and winter was already coming. So he made the decision that would echo through the ages. He left his camp without a single guard. He crossed the Trident alone, a solitary figure in furs and iron. He walked past the ranks of the Conqueror's army, a quiet king carrying a simple circlet of bronze and iron. He entered the royal pavilion of the Dragon Lord. He laid his crown at Aegon's feet. It was a complete submission. Aegon accepted the surrender with respect. He knew the value of such a sacrifice. He raised Torrhen to his feet. Torrhen Stark rose again, not as a king, but as the Lord of Winterfell and the Warden of the North. The pact was sworn. The lands from the Neck to the Wall were folded into the kingdom. Torrhen Stark had bent the knee, but he had kept his head, his people, and his house. He is forever remembered as the king who knelt, but in the private histories of the North, he is the king who saved his realm from fire and blood. The North was peaceful. The realm of the Iron Throne now touched the frozen shore. Only one of the ancient kingdoms remained untested. In the high peaks of the Mountains of the Moon, the Eyrie stood in its impregnable solitude, and the young king of the Vale weighed the fate of his own proud realm. Shara Arryn, a queen regent ruling in her young son's name, believed the Vale was absolutely untouchable. She had fortified the Bloody Gate, the formidable mountain pass that had broken 1,000 armies throughout history. She felt secure behind her towering walls of stone and ice, confident that no army on earth could scale the cliffs of the Giant's Lance. But the Targaryens did not play by the ancient rules of mountain warfare. Visenya Targaryen bypassed the Bloody Gate entirely. On the back of her great dragon, Varga, she soared high above the clouds, ascending to the highest peak where the Eyrie sat like a crown of stone. She bypassed the defences, the gates, and the sheer cliffs, landing directly in the middle of the castle's inner courtyard. When Queen Shara rushed out with her guards, expecting a bloody siege, she instead found her young son, Ronel, looking up in absolute wonder. The boy was sitting on Visenya's knee, completely enchanted by the massive, breathing beast before him. He looked at his mother and asked if he could go for a ride on the dragon. Shara Arryn was a proud ruler, but she was also a mother. She looked at the dragon, then at her son, and realised that the highest mountain in Westeros was nothing more than a minor obstacle to the beasts of Valyria. She surrendered her crown on the spot. Young Ronald got his flight, circling the giant's lance 3 times, and the Vale was brought into the fold without a single drop of blood being spilled. With the north and the Vale secured, only Dawn remained, a land of burning sands and unyielding spirits that would prove to be the Conqueror's greatest challenge. The king who Knelt had saved his kingdom from the fire, but the conquest was not over. From the banks of the Trident, Aegon's gaze turned east, toward the peaks of the Mountains of the Moon. There, the last realm of the eastern seaboard stood waiting. The Vale of Arryn had remained a silent spectator to the fall of the River Kings and the Storm Kings. Their regent, a woman named Shara Arryn, ruled in the name of her young son, Ronald. She had no intention of joining the kingdoms that had already bent the knee. Shara Arryn was a formidable woman. She had watched Harrenhal burn. She had heard the stories from the Field of Fire. She knew exactly what a dragon could do to a city, to an army, to a kingdom. So she fell back on the one advantage the Vale had always held over every invader who had ever come before: the mountains. She fortified the legendary fortress of the Bloody Gate, the choke point that had stopped Andals and First Men alike for thousands of years. And then she withdrew to the one place in all of Westeros that had never been taken by anyone ever: the Eyrie. The impregnable fortress perched 6,000 feet in the sky, a structure designed to be proof against the world itself. She gathered her son, the boy King Ronald, and prepared for a siege that she believed would outlast the dragons themselves. It was a strategy with centuries of history behind it. Unfortunately for Shara, the conquest had already rewritten the rules of history. Aegon, or perhaps it was Visenya, looked at the problem and saw a solution that no general of the old world could have imagined. You do not take the Eyrie by siege. You do not take it by breaking its walls. You take it by ignoring them entirely. Visenya Targaryen mounted Vhagar and took to the skies. She did not fly at the Bloody Gate. She did not follow the winding path of the High Road. Instead, she flew straight over the top of every defense the Vale possessed. She bypassed every watchtower, every garrison, every castle perched on the mountain slopes. Vhagar rose on the thermals, passed over the peak of the Giant's Lance, and descended directly into the inner courtyard of the Eyrie. The impregnable fortress had a roof, and Vhagar had just landed on it. Shara Arryn felt the castle shake. She heard the panicked shouts of her garrison, the roar of something enormous. Certain that her son was dead or taken, she grabbed a sword and rushed to the courtyard with her knights, prepared to fight to the death. What she found was not a scene of bloodshed. It was a scene of pure quiet magic. Visenya Targaryen was seated on a stone bench in the middle of the yard. Her armor was dark. Her face was stern. The great green dragon was coiled behind her, steam rising from its nostrils. And on Visenya's lap, utterly transfixed and completely unafraid, sat Ronald Arryn. The boy king was not crying. He was not afraid. He was staring at the dragon with the eyes of a child, seeing a dream come true. Before Shara could speak, before she could scream or beg or attack, her son looked up at the stern warrior holding him, and then turned to his mother. His voice carried across the silent courtyard. "Mother," he said, "can I have a ride on the dragon?" In that moment, Shara Arryn understood the totality of her defeat. The war was over. It had been over the moment Vhagar cast its shadow over the castle. Her son was not a hostage. He was a convert. The Targaryens had won this kingdom, not by fire and blood, but by wonder. Shara sank to her knees. She yielded the crown of the Vale of Arryn, the slender circlet of silver and sapphire she had worn as regent. She sent ravens to her bannermen, commanding them to lay down their arms and pledge their fealty to the Iron Throne. And true to the boy's request, Visenya Targaryen took Ronald Arryn for his flight. She strapped the boy king to Vhagar's back, and they soared around the peak of the Giant's Lance. The wind howled in his ears. The stone walls of the Eyrie shrank to a speck. The whole of the Vale spread out beneath him like a map. The bloodless submission of the Vale is one of the strangest and most charming stories of the entire conquest. A kingdom was surrendered so a boy could ride a dragon. With the Vale's surrender, Aegon the Conqueror had achieved the impossible. The 6 kingdoms of Westeros had all submitted to his rule. Torrhen Stark had knelt, Loren Lannister had knelt, Shara Arryn had knelt. The great military campaign was over, but the work of building a dynasty, of turning the ashes of the old world into a throne that would last for generations, was only just beginning. A king without a crown is merely a warlord. A realm without a capital is just an encampment. The army turned south, towards the oldest city in Westeros, where the blessing of the faith and the vaults of the citadel awaited. The moment of reckoning between the Dragon Lords and the gods of the 7 kingdoms was about to begin. From the Vale, where Visenya had landed Vargar in the Orys inner courtyard and secured the Boy King's submission, Aegon's path now led south. The Conquest had broken the Riverlands, the Reach, and the West. But one city remained that was not simply a military target. Oldtown was the religious and intellectual heart of Westeros, the seat of the faith and the home of the citadel, where mesters trained and knowledge was preserved. It was defended not only by its ancient walls, but by the powerful House Hightower, whose wealth and influence rivaled any in the realm. Aegon marched toward Oldtown, and the city knew he was coming. Lord Manfred Hightower commanded formidable defences, but the memory of Harrenhal and the Field of Fire hung heavy over every lord who considered resistance. Still, the Hightowers had not yet bent the knee, and the faith of the 7 had no love for foreign dragon lords from Valyria. The tension inside the city was palpable, and all eyes turned to the Starry Sept, where the High Septon had taken refuge. For 7 days and 7 nights, the High Septon locked himself within the Starry Sept, praying, without pause, to the 7 for guidance. He begged for a sign, for wisdom to know whether to fight or yield. The city's fate rested on his word, and the weight of that responsibility pressed down on him as the days passed. He did not eat, he did not sleep. He knelt before the altar, reciting prayers until his voice was raw and his knees ached against the cold stone. And on the 7th night, as exhaustion blurred the edge of his vision, the crone appeared to him. She revealed a vision of what would come if Oldtown chose to fight. The city would burn. The citadel, with its libraries and towers of learning, would be reduced to cinders. The Starry Sept itself, the holiest place in all of Westeros, would be consumed by dragonfire. Thousands would die, and the legacy of the faith would be washed away in ash and blood. There was no victory to be found in defiance, only annihilation. The High Septon emerged from the Sept with his answer, and he sent word to Lord Manfred Hightower. Manfred heard the prophecy and understood what it meant. He could fortify the walls, arm every man in the city, and pray for a miracle, but the vision had shown him the truth. The dragons could not be stopped, so instead of preparing for siege, he ordered the gates opened. The streets of Oldtown were lined with banners and clergy as Aegon and his army approached, and when they entered the city, they were welcomed not as conquerors, but as saviours. The bells of the Starry Sept rang out, and the High Septon himself came forward to bless the Targaryen host. Oldtown had opened its gates without a single arrow fired, without a drop of blood spilled. Aegon accepted the submission gracefully, and in doing so, he won something more valuable than a city. He won the approval of the faith. The spiritual authority of the 7 kingdoms had recognized him, and that recognition would become the bedrock of his rule. The smiths and scholars and priests of Oldtown now worked in service of the new dynasty, and the Dragon Lord who had burned fields and fortresses found himself welcomed into the most sacred hall in the realm. The war was not over, but the last great stronghold of the south had fallen not through fire, but through faith. 3 days after his entry into the city, Aegon Targaryen rode to the Starry Sept for his official coronation. It was here, in the heart of the faith, that his conquest was truly legitimized. The High Septon anointed him with the 7 holy oils and placed the crown of Valyrian steel and rubies upon his brow. He was proclaimed Aegon of House Targaryen, first of his name, King of the Andals and the first men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and protector of the realm. Although his ancestors had worshipped the gods of old Valyria, Aegon understood that to rule Westeros, he must embrace the faith of its people. This act of devotion secured the loyalty of millions who would have otherwise seen him as a foreign usurper. From this day forward, the history of the realm would be divided. The years before this moment would be known as before Conquest, and the years that followed as after Conquest. The Grand Maesters of the Citadel began their records anew, marking the coronation as the official beginning of the Targaryen dynasty. Yet, even as the bells of Oldtown rang in celebration, the work of unifying the continent was far from complete. To the far south lay the burning sands of Dorne, where Princess Meria Martell, the yellow toad of Sunspear, watched the conquerors rise with quiet defiance. She had no intention of bending the knee, and her land would prove to be a grave for many Targaryen soldiers in the years to come. Furthermore, Aegon still needed a permanent seat of power. He did not choose Oldtown, nor did he rule from Dragonstone. Instead, he returned to the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where his journey had begun. There, on the 3 hills where his army had first camped, a new city was beginning to take shape. It was a chaotic, muddy settlement of timber and thatch, but it would soon grow into the sprawling capital known as King's Landing. From this new seat, Aegon would forge the Iron Throne from the melted swords of his defeated enemies, a stark reminder of the cost of defiance and the absolute power of the dragon. The High Septon emerged from the starry sept on the 7th day, his faith not shattered, but reforged by the silence and solitude. He had received his answer, a sign not of defiance but of accommodation. The gates of Oldtown, the city of spires and learning, the very heart of the faith in Westeros, were thrown open to the dragon, and on the first day of the first month of the new year, Aegon Targaryen entered the city not as a conqueror at the head of a pillaging army, but as a king coming to be crowned. The streets were lined with silent onlookers, Septon and small folk alike, watching the man who had burned their armies and shattered their kingdoms walk calmly past them on foot, flanked only by his sister wives. It was a masterful piece of theatre. Aegon understood that force wins wars, but ritual wins peace. The ceremony took place in the Starry Sept, the most sacred structure in all of Westeros. It was a building older than the Targaryen dynasty, older even than the Doom of Valyria, built of black marble, whose ceiling was a lattice of crystal that cast 1,000 points of starlight across the sanctuary floor, even in the midday sun. Before the altar of the Father, the High Septon waited. He was an old man, heavy with years and with the weight of the choice he had made. The Lords of the Reach and the West had gathered. Lord Hightower himself stood in attendance, the great beacon of his tower, looking on from a distance. Aegon knelt. The act itself sent a shockwave through every noble in attendance. The dragon, the man who had consigned Harren the Black to a molten grave, who had burned 4,000 men alive on the field of fire, knelt before a servant of the Seven. The High Septon placed his hand upon Aegon's head and spoke the ancient prayers of the faith. He produced a crystal phial filled with the 7 sacred oils, blessed by 7 High Septons over 7 generations. He poured the oil over Aegon's brow, letting it run down his face and onto the white silk tunic he wore, in a low, steady voice that carried through the absolute silence of the sept. He spoke the words that changed the world. The High Septon anoints Aegon with the holy oils and crowns him King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men. The crown was not the simple circlet of black steel and Valyrian rubies that Aegon had worn in battle. This was a crown of gold, studded with gems, a crown that belonged to the faith and to the tradition of the 7 kingdoms. Aegon accepted it. This religious endorsement legitimizes Aegon's rule in the eyes of the common people and the deeply pious nobility. Every maester, every septon in every village, every pious lord who had feared that a foreign Valyrian godless conqueror would destroy their faith now had a reason to obey. The faith of the 7 had accepted Aegon. Aegon had submitted to the faith. Aegon adopts the faith of the 7. demonstrating his willingness to adapt to the culture of his new subjects to ensure stability. This is the moment that binds the Conquest together. He did not burn the septs. He did not forbid the worship of the old gods. He simply bent the knee in the starry sept, and by that single gesture, told the continent that he would be their king, not just their master. He would rule in the name of the gods, the people already feared. It is a lesson in statecraft that rivals any military maneuver he ever made. He understood that to rule Westeros, he had to become Westerosi. The calendar of Westeros is officially reset, marking this moment as year 1 AC after the Conquest. Everything before it is prehistory, the age of 100 kingdoms, the age of chaos. Everything after is the reign of the dragon. It is a profound act of narrative control. Aegon did not just conquer the land. He conquered time itself, forcing every future generation to measure their years by his victory. The ceremony did not end with the crown. Aegon swore to defend the faith, to protect its servants, and to uphold its laws. The High Septon, in turn, recognized Aegon's authority over the whole continent, including the lands that had not yet surrendered. It was a covenant. The faith would pray for the king, and the king would protect the faith. This compact would define the relationship between the Iron Throne and the Starry Sept for centuries. Oldtown itself secured a unique status. It was not sacked. It was not garrisoned by Targaryen soldiers. It remained the seat of the highest learning in the land and the home of the faith. The Hightowers, through their careful diplomacy, managed to keep their city intact and their influence strong. Lord Hightower was named Lord of the Port and Voice of Oldtown, and Aegon confirmed all the ancient charters and privileges of the city. In return, the wealth and wisdom of Oldtown were now at the service of the Iron Throne. With Oldtown secure and the faith bound to him, Aegon had achieved what no one had ever done. He was the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. The title was no longer a boast. It was a fact stamped into the calendar itself, that the crown is a weight, not just a symbol. A king needs more than a ceremony to hold a kingdom together. He needs a seat of power, a city from which to command, and a throne that tells every lord who sees it exactly what happened to the last men who thought they could oppose him. And so, even as the oils of the starry sept dried on his brow, Aegon turned his gaze east, back to the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where a crude fort of wood and earth was waiting to be reborn into something far greater. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The crown of Oldtown had legitimized Aegon's rule in the eyes of the faith and the great houses of the south. One by one, the kingdoms had submitted. The Reach, the West, the Stormlands, the Vale, the North, all had recognized the Targaryen dynasty, all except one. Far to the south, across the burning sands and the red mountains that guarded its borders, lay the Principality of Dawn. It was a land as fierce and independent as the people who inhabited it. It had never been conquered by any foreign power, not by the Valyrian freehold at its height, and not by the Storm Kings of old. Aegon the Conqueror intended to change that. He sent his sister wife, Rhaenys, to lead the invasion. She was the most politically astute of the 3 Targaryen siblings, a skilled diplomat who had brought kingdoms into the fold with a mixture of charm and overwhelming force. She rode Meraxes, the Golden Queen of the Dragons, second in size only to Balerion himself. She had personally accepted the submission of the Stormlands and negotiated the peaceful transition of the Reach. After the Field of Fire, she expected the same swift submission she witnessed in the other kingdoms. The logic of Dragonfire was undeniable. No army could stand before it. No wall could withstand it. The Dornish were a proud people, but they were not fools. They would see the shadow of Meraxes and know that resistance meant annihilation. But the Dornish lords had studied the Conquest carefully. They had watched Harren the Black burn alive in his own tower. They had seen the Gardener Kings turn to ash on the Field of Fire. They knew they could not win a conventional battle against dragons. so they refused to fight one. They abandoned their castles, leaving them stripped of supplies and defenders. They retreated into the harsh deserts and impassable mountain passes of their homeland, taking their armies with them. Rhaenys and her host marched deeper into dawn, and they found only silence. The great castles of the lords, the strongholds of the bannermen, all of them empty. The defenders had vanished. In some keeps, the Targaryen soldiers found only the old, the infirm and children, the people who could not travel or fight. It was a macabre and frustrating spectacle. There was no one to demand surrender from, no army to burn, no king to behead. The Dornish strategy was a masterclass in asymmetric warfare. They gave the dragon nothing to kill. The heat was oppressive. The supplies dwindled. The Dornish did not fight in great armies, but in small, vicious bands that struck the Targaryen columns from the cover of the dunes, poisoning wells and cutting down stragglers. The invasion was bogged down in a war of attrition that the dragons could not win. Pressing south, Rhaenys reached the ancient seat of House Martell, the Palace of Sunspear. She had come to speak with the ruler of Dawn, the Princess Meria Martell, a woman known throughout the Seven Kingdoms as the Yellow Toad of the Sands. Meria was old, nearly blind, and possessed of a will as unyielding as the stone of her towers. Rhaenys confronted the princess in her hall, flanked by the guards of Sunspear. He offered the same terms that Aegon had given to every other king in Westeros. Bend the knee, swear fealty to the Iron Throne, and keep your lands and your titles. The princess refused without hesitation. She warned Rhaenys that Dawn would never bend, bow, or break. She told the Targaryen queen to take her message back to her brother. Dawn was not his. Dawn would never be his. Rhaenys understood the weight of these words. This was not a bluff. Meria was willing to see her people suffer, willing to see her castle burn, rather than submit to a foreign conqueror. Rhaenys could have called down Meraxes and turned Sunspear into a pyre. But what would that achieve? Killing an old woman and her household would not conquer the country. It would only seal an eternal hatred between Dawn and the Iron Throne. Rhaenys showed restraint. She withdrew from Sunspear, her mission incomplete. The Targaryen forces pulled back from Dawn, leaving the principality unoccupied, unconquered, and defiant. It was the first true failure of Aegon's conquest. A stark reminder that the power of dragons had limits against a people who refused to be ruled by fear. This defiance shaped the next phase of Aegon's reign. The king understood that Dawn could not be taken by a single campaign. It would require a different kind of strategy, a long game of patience and pressure that would span years and decades. The Seven Kingdoms remained 6, a fact that chafed at the Conqueror's ambition and created an open wound on the map of his new realm. Rhaenys returned to the Aegonfort, her defeat a rare shadow over the glory of the Conquest. The experience taught the Targaryens a hard lesson about the limits of fire and blood. With the southern border sealed by a people who refused to bow, Aegon shifted his focus entirely to the consolidation of the 6 kingdoms he had won. There was a capital to build, a throne to forge from the swords of his vanquished enemies, and a realm to unite under the laws of the Iron Throne. The work of turning a military conquest into a dynasty was only just beginning. Rhaenys Targaryen did not find a conquered country. She found a trap. The great castles of Dawn stood empty, their great halls echoing with silence. The lords and warriors were gone. All that remained were the old, the infirm, and the children. This was not surrender. It was a deliberate opening strategy. The Dornish had watched Aegon's conquest unfold. They saw the shadow of Balerion fall over Harrenhal. They felt the heat of the field of fire. They understood the single, inescapable weakness of an army built around overwhelming force. It is entirely useless if it cannot find its target. So the Dornish refused to give the Targaryens a target. The First Dornish War did not begin with a clash of armies. It began with the silence of an abandoned castle. It began with a patrol, vanishing in the passes of the Boneway, their horses found wandering, the men simply gone. It began with a garrison captain in the southern marches, discovering his well had been poisoned with the bodies of the dead. It began with the slow, quiet death of any man who strayed too far from the main column. The Dornish did not fight as knights. They fought as shadows. They struck from behind rocks, loosed a volley of arrows, and melted back into a landscape they had known since birth. They killed the foragers. They burned the supply wagons. They left the Targaryen army to starve and wither under a sun that offered no mercy. It was a war of 1,000 cuts, and the first casualty were not soldiers, but the very hope of a swift victory. And the dragons, the instruments of absolute power, were utterly powerless. Whenever Balerion or Meraxes or Vargar took to the sky, their great wings casting shadows over the dunes, the Dornish simply ceased to exist. They hid in caves carved into the cliffsides, in the dry riverbeds, beneath the rocky overhangs of the Red Mountains. The heat shimmering off the sand made it impossible to spot them from the air. What could a dragon burn? Empty fields, abandoned towers. The very land was a shield, so the great beasts flew over an empty country, their fire wasted on sand and stone. It was a campaign of profound frustration, and when the sun went down, the Dornish emerged from their holes. They did not face the dragons. They did not need to. They simply found the men who had made camp. The garrisons left to hold a worthless castle, and they exacted a terrible price. They slipped past the sentries with blades blackened, so they would not glint in the starlight. They cut the throats of men as they slept. They set fire to the pavilions of knights and captains. By the time the alarm was raised, they were already gone, faded back into the desert darkness. The Targaryen occupation of Dorne was not a military garrison. It was a waking nightmare. The frustration in King's Landing boiled over. Aegon the Conqueror had united 6 kingdoms in less than 2 years. He would not suffer this defiance. So he and his sister Visenya took to the field themselves, joining Rhaenys with the full and terrible might of House Targaryen. Balerion the Black Dread, the largest living dragon since the doom of Valyria, descended upon the Dornish marches. Vhagar, immense and scarred from 100 battles, flew at his side. It was the most terrifying display of power the world had ever seen. But the Dornish still refused to assemble in the open. Aegon himself, astride the greatest beast in the world, found himself reduced to burning empty keeps and orphaned towers. Visenya, as fierce as any man alive, found no enemy to challenge her. The power of the dragons hinged on the enemy, making the mistake of giving battle. The Dornish simply would not do it. It was a war of exhaustion, a war of patience, and the Dornish were masters of patience. The war quickly became a costly, bloody quagmire. The Targaryen treasury bled gold to supply an army spread thin over a hostile land. Ships from the Reach were harried by Dornish raiders. Supply trains through the Boneway were ambushed and destroyed. The army itself, made up of soldiers from the Stormlands, the Reach, and the Crownlands, began to crumble. They had marched for glory. They had expected to be part of a legend. Instead, they found an endless, merciless summer, foul water, and the constant fear of an arrow in the dark. Men deserted in droves. Others took their own lives, rather than face another day of the same grinding, hopeless occupation. Morale vanished, scattered by the desert wind like ash. Aegon the Conqueror had broken every army that stood against him, but he could not break the spirit of a people who refused to be conquered. The Dornish had turned the very act of cogitation into a weapon. The beast of a unified Westeros was being bled dry by 100 tiny cuts, and no dragon could cauterize the wound. The longer this frustration festered in the Targaryen high command, the more desperate they became for a single, decisive victory. The careful, patient strategy of the early occupation gave way to hunches and riskier gambles. Commanders pushed deeper into the desert, chasing phantoms, looking for an enemy that refused to be found in an open field. The patience of the Dragon Lords had finally run dry, and in this atmosphere of paranoia and exhaustion, the campaign began to stretch its supply lines and forces thin, pushing further into the heart of a country that was already bleeding them dry. The great gamble of the Dornish War was heading toward its most critical and costly phase. The First Dornish War had exposed the deepest flaw in the Targaryen strategy of conquest. The dragons were terrifying, but they could not find an enemy who refused to stand and fight. Month after month, Rhaenys and her armies chased phantoms across the scorched deserts of Dorne, burning empty keeps and watching their strength bleed away in small, unattended tragedies. A woman fetching water, a sentry disappearing from his post, a well fouled with poison by morning. The Dornish were not trying to win a battle, they were trying to survive a war, and by surviving, they were winning. Frustrated by this invisible attrition, Rhaenys grew impatient. She needed a victory the realm could see. She needed a castle that would burn. And so, in the 10th year after the conquest, she turned Meraxes toward the stronghold of House Ulla, a place called Hellholt. The walls of Hellholt were thick, and the defenders were determined. Rhaenys, confident in the absolute power of her dragon, decided to take the castle from the air in a single devastating pass. She dove Meraxes toward the highest tower, breathing fire ahead of her, expecting the garrison to break and run. But the Dornish of Hellholt held their ground. They had prepared a massive scorpion, a weapon designed to pierce the hide of a dragon, was aimed not at the body, but at the head. In 10 AC, during an assault on the castle of Hellholt, a scorpion bolt pierces the eye of the dragon Meraxes. The effect was immediate. The massive beast falls from the sky, destroying the castle's highest tower and crushing Queen Rhaenys beneath her. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The Queen of the Seven Kingdoms and one of the 3 dragons that had conquered a continent were extinguished in a single heartbeat. The news reached King's Landing, carried by a raven with a single message. The Queen was dead. The dragon was dead. Rhaenys' body is never recovered, sparking centuries of dark rumours regarding her ultimate fate in the dungeons of Dorne. Some say she died in the fall. Others whisper that she lived, that she was taken into the darkness below Hellholt, kept alive as a humiliation to her brother the Conqueror. Neither story could ever be confirmed. The Dornish never returned a body. They never confirmed a burial. They held the mystery like a knife against the throat of the Iron Throne. The realm was left to imagine the worst. The loss of a dragon and a beloved queen shatters the myth of Targaryen invincibility and plunges the realm into mourning. Aegon himself was broken by the news. The man who had never lost anything, who had built a kingdom from fire and blood, had lost his sister, his wife, and his greatest weapon in a single moment. The celebrations of the conquest fell silent. The bards sang dirges. The court at the Aegonfort, a rough structure of wood and ambition, suddenly felt empty and fragile. Nothing would ever be the same. Aegon did not abandon Dorne in the aftermath. He swore vengeance. He sent more armies. But the war had changed. The joy had gone out of it. It was no longer a glorious conquest. It was a bloody, grinding desire for revenge. Eventually, reason prevailed. The cost was too high. The other kingdoms grew restless. Aegon called a halt. He did not surrender. He simply stopped. The border between Dorne and the Seven Kingdoms hardened into a standing peace, an exception carved into the very idea of the unified realm. For the rest of his reign, Aegon would turn his attention not to conquering more land, but to building the institutions that would hold what he already had. The Red Keep rose from the hill overlooking the Blackwater. The King's Road began to stretch like a spine across the continent. The Iron Throne, forged from the swords of his enemies, became not just a seat of power, but a symbol of the law that bound the kingdoms together. The war in Dorne had taught him that some things could not be taken by fire. They had to be built. Yet the peace was not easily won, nor was it a simple matter of turning away. The wounds of the war ran deep, and the Dornish were not done testing the resolve of the Iron Throne. It was during this period of uneasy quiet that Princess Daeria of Dorne arrived in King's Landing, carrying a peace offering that would forever alter the course of Targaryen history. She brought with her the skull of the great dragon Meraxes, a grim reminder of the tragedy at Hellholt, bleached white by the Dornish sun. But it was not the skull that broke the king's resolve. It was a letter, delivered by Daria's own hand, written by her father, Prince Nymor Martell. The letter was meant for Aegon's eyes alone. The contents of that letter remain one of the greatest mysteries in the history of the Seven Kingdoms. Those who watched the king read it, reported that his face went pale, and he squeezed the parchment so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Some say the letter revealed that Rhaenys was still alive, mutilated and suffering in the dungeons of the Ullars, and that her release or a merciful death depended on Aegon signing the peace treaty. Others believe it contained a curse, or perhaps a threat to hire the faceless men of Braavos to assassinate young Prince Rhaenys, Aegon's only heir at the time. Whatever was written upon that parchment, it achieved what years of fire and blood could not. Aegon rose from the Iron Throne, walked to the hearth, and burned the letter. The very next morning, he signed the Treaty of Peace, recognizing Dorne as an independent kingdom, forever free from Targaryen rule. With the Dornish threat finally pacified, the remaining years of Aegon's reign were defined by a quiet, almost solemn stability. Alongside Queen Visenya, who remained his sharpest advisor and the fierce protector of their lineage, Aegon travelled the realm on his royal progresses. He made sure the lords of the Seven Kingdoms saw their king, not as a conqueror on a dragon, but as a ruler who listened to their grievances and administered justice. Visenya, ever vigilant, recognised that the peace was fragile. Following an attempt on Aegon's life by Dornish-aligned cutthroats in the streets of the city, she took it upon herself to establish the Kingsguard, 7 elite knights, sworn to protect the king with their lives, clothed in white and bound by sacred vows. They would become the shield of the dynasty, a living testament to the lessons learned in the shadow of Hellholt. When Aegon finally passed away in the 37th year after the conquest, he left behind a kingdom that was united in law, if not entirely in geography. The conqueror was gone, but the foundations he laid would endure for nearly 3 centuries. The year is 10 AC. Queen Rhaenys is dead. Meraxes, the golden dragon, lies shattered in the ruins of Hellholt. Aegon the Conqueror had never lost a battle. He had never lost a wife. He had never tasted true defeat. Now he tasted all 3 at once, and the fire that rose from his grief would scorch the sands of Dorne for 2 terrible years. This was the dragon's wrath. For 2 years, Aegon and his remaining sister wife, Visenya, waged a campaign of pure designed terror. Every castle in Dorne was put to the torch. Every keep, every tower, every stone fortification was bombarded with dragon flame until it melted and collapsed. There was one deliberate exception: Sunspear, the seat of House Martell. By sparing the capital of Dorne, Aegon hoped to breed resentment among the other Dornish lords. He wanted the lords of the lesser castles to look at Sunspear unscathed and untouched, and wonder why their homes had burned while the Martells remained safe. It was a calculated cruelty designed to shatter the unity that had so thoroughly baffled the Targaryen war machine. But Dorne did not fracture. The Dornish suffered. Their castles became blackened husks, but their will remained unbroken. And while Aegon burned their castles from the air, the Dornish struck back at the heart of his power on the ground. A band of Dornish assassins infiltrated the Aegonfort itself. They slipped past the king's guard and found their way into his private chambers. They nearly killed him. Aegon, unarmed and caught off guard in what should have been the sanctuary of his own home, faced death at the hands of the men he had tried to destroy. This is where Visenya Targaryen entered the story, not just as a queen or a dragon rider, but as a warrior. She was always the sharper of the 2 remaining Targaryen siblings, the one who kept the Valyrian dynasty sword Dark's sister close at hand. When the assassins struck, Visenya was there. She drew Dark's sister and cut them down, defending her brother's life with a blade that had been forged in the fires of old Valyria. The assassination attempt was a profound shock to the Targaryen court. It proved that a king could be vulnerable even in his own hall. The old traditions were not enough. This moment directly led to the creation of a new institution, a permanent, elite royal bodyguard. The Kingsguard was born. 7 knights of unmatched skill, sworn to serve for life, their vows placing the king's safety above all titles, lands or family. But the Kingsguard could not solve the Dornish problem. The dragon's wrath had spent itself. Every castle had been burned, the king had been nearly killed in his own bed, and Dorne still refused to kneel. Aegon understood. Finally, that dragonfire could not hold what it could not terrify into submission. The scorched earth of Dorne became a testament to the limits of absolute power. The war was not over, but it was transforming. The fire had failed. The realm of Aegon the Conqueror would have to learn to live with its open wound. A constant reminder that the 7 kingdoms were not truly 7. The completeness of the conquest had been denied, and a new, slower kind of siege would have to begin. The years that followed the dragon's wrath were not defined by grand battles, but by a quiet, bloody stalemate. It was a war of shadows, of poisoned cups and knives in the dark. For every Dornish outpost the Targaryens managed to seize, a garrison of occupation was slaughtered in its sleep the very next night. The toll on the realm was immense, both in gold and in blood, and the frustration in King's Landing grew with every passing moon. Then, in the year 13 AC, the ancient and stubborn ruler of Dorne, Princess Meria Martell, finally passed away. The yellow toad of Sunspear was gone. Her son, Prince Nymor, inherited a land of ash and bones. Nymor was a man of peace, weary of the endless cycle of death, but he was also a Martell. He would not kneel. Instead of sending an army, Prince Nymor sent an embassy of peace, led by his own daughter, Princess Daria. They arrived in King's Landing carrying a grim gift: the skull of the dragon Meraxes, bleached white by the Dornish sun. The sight of the dragon's skull in the great hall of the Aegonfort was a bitter insult to many in the Targaryen court. Lord Orys Baratheon, who had lost his hand to the Dornish years prior, urged the king to send Daria to the dungeons. Others demanded she be burned as an offering to the memory of Queen Rhaenys. But Princess Daria had not come to beg. She stepped forward and presented King Aegon with a sealed letter written by her father's own hand. She insisted that the letter was for the king's eyes alone. Aegon took the parchment and read it in silence before the entire court. Those who watched the king's face saw his expression harden. His knuckles turned white, and his grip on the arm of the Iron Throne was so fierce that he cut his hand on one of the melted swords. Without speaking a single word to his council, his sister Visenya, or the Dornish delegation, Aegon rose from the throne. He walked out of the hall, mounted Balerion the Black Dread, and flew away toward Dragonstone. He remained on the ancestral island of his house for a single night. What he did there, or what thoughts consumed him as he stared out over the dark waters of Blackwater Bay, no one will ever know. But when he returned to King's Landing the next morning, the Conqueror was changed. He agreed to the peace. He signed a treaty that recognized Dorne as an independent nation, completely free of the rule of the Iron Throne. The First Dornish War was over, not with the triumph of Dragonfire, but with a stroke of a quill. For centuries, scholars and maesters have debated what was written in Prince Nymor's letter. Some believe the Martells threatened to hire the faceless men of Braavos to assassinate Aegon's young son and heir, Rhaenys. Others suggest the letter contained proof that Queen Rhaenys had not died in the fall at Hellholt, but had survived, mutilated and broken, kept alive in a dungeon. The letter, some say, offered to end her torment mercifully in exchange for peace. Whatever the truth, the secret died with Aegon the Conqueror. The Dragon Lords had united 6 kingdoms, but the 7th remained beyond their grasp, a defiant land of sand and stone that would not be brought into the realm for another 150 years. The 2 years of the dragon's wrath were a masterclass in terror, but they were not a victory. Dorne remained independent, a stubborn splinter in Aegon's dream of a unified continent. He and Visenya returned to the nascent capital not as conquerors of a unified land, but as rulers of a heavily wounded, incomplete state. The war was over, but the peace was a raw and open wound. For Aegon, the failure in Dorne forced a fundamental shift in his thinking. Raw military might the dragons, had found their limit. For the 6 kingdoms he had successfully bent to his will, he needed a different kind of power, a permanent one, an unassailable symbol that would outlast the rebellion of a single region. And so, he looked to the physical evidence of his victory, the swords. He ordered the collection of thousands of swords, surrendered by his defeated enemies. Swords poured into the Aegonfort from every corner of the continent, the twisted greatswords of House Gardner, who had been wiped from history at the Field of Fire, the black steel of the Hoares, pulled from the ruined towers of Harrenhal, the gilded blades of the Lannisters, the iron weapons of the Starks, the ornate steel of the Storm King. Every sword was a conquered house. Every blade was a lord who had bent the knee. These thousands of blades were brought to the Aegonfort. They were not to be melted into simple ingots. The king demanded a throne made of war itself. The first fire for this forge could not be lit by any common means. It had to come from the source of the Conquest itself. Balerion the Black Dread was summoned. Using the intense heat of Balerion's breath, the swords were melted, twisted, and forged into a massive, jagged throne. The same fire that had melted the stone of Harrenhal now breathed upon the surrendered steel, fusing them into a single monstrous creation. The result was a colossal, sprawling throne of 1,000 points. The stonemasons and armourers who had shaped it asked the king if they should grind the edges dull to make the seat safe for a ruler. Aegon refused absolutely. The Iron Throne was intentionally left sharp and uncomfortable, a reminder that a king should never sit easily upon his seat. Every chair in every castle across the 7 kingdoms offers comfort and rest. This one offered only a constant, subtle threat. A king who forgot the cost of his crown would be cut. A lord who knelt too carelessly would be pricked. The throne itself was a test of resolve. The Iron Throne became the ultimate visual representation of Aegon's military dominance and the coercive nature of his rule. It is not merely a seat of government. It is a cage made of the weapons of the governed. Every lord who approaches it sees his own steel, or the steel of his vanquished kin, surrounding the king he swore to serve. It turns the memory of the conquest into a daily physical reality. It is the war made permanent and immovable, with the great symbol of his authority complete. The conqueror could finally turn his full attention to the challenging business of ruling, the slow work of building a dynasty, of appointing lords and settling disputes, of transforming the Aegonfort into a true capital. The war was over. The dance of diplomacy and governance had truly begun. To govern 6 disparate kingdoms that had spent thousands of years fighting one another, Aegon knew he could not rule from a distant, isolated tower. He had to be seen. He had to become a living presence in the lives of his subjects, from the grandest lord to the humblest peasant. Thus began the tradition of the royal progress. For half of every year, the king and his court travelled the realm. It was a massive, expensive undertaking, a rolling city of lords, knights, ladies and councillors moving from castle to castle. Aegon rode Balerion, a terrifying shadow passing over the fields and forests, reminding everyone of the power that held the realm together. But on the ground, he was a dispenser of justice. He sat in the halls of his lords, listening to their disputes, confirming their ancient rights, and gently, firmly weaving them into a single legal fabric. He did not seek to destroy their local laws. Instead, he respected their customs while introducing the concept of the king's peace. If 2 lords had a dispute, they would no longer go to war. They would appeal to the Iron Throne. This was the true magic of Aegon's rule. He made himself indispensable. Meanwhile, the muddy settlement around the Aegonfort was rapidly transforming. What had begun as a collection of wooden longhouses and earthwork walls was fast becoming King's Landing, a bustling metropolis of trade and power. Merchants from the free cities, Septons from Oldtown, and traders from the Reach crowded the narrow, chaotic streets. The scent of wood smoke, sea salt and refuse filled the air as stone walls began to rise, placing the temporary wooden fortifications. Yet, even as the city grew and the realm enjoyed a fragile stability, the shadow of dawn never truly faded. The southern border remained a tense, unhealed scar, a constant reminder that the Conqueror's work was incomplete. But for now, the realm had a king, a capital, and a throne. The foundation of the Targaryen dynasty had been poured in blood and forged in dragonfire, and the long, uneasy peace of the dragon had finally begun. A conqueror is often defined by his greatest victory, but a ruler is defined by what he builds afterward. Aegon the Conqueror had forged the ultimate symbol of his authority, the Iron Throne, a seat of melted steel and surrendered ambition. Yet in the early years of his reign, this throne of 1,000 swords sat within the crude wooden walls of the Aegonfort, a fortress built from the timbers of the Blackwater rush. It was a foothold, a war camp made permanent by necessity. But a wooden fort was no fit seat for the king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men. It was a temporary shelter for a king who intended to rule forever. So Aegon looked upon the 3 hills, where he had first set foot on the shores of Westeros, and he made a deliberate choice that would reshape the continent. He took the land around the Aegonfort, the ground his army had seized and held, and he declared it the new capital of the entire realm. He named it with the blunt directness that marked all of his actions, King's Landing. It was not a name born from ancient history or poetic tradition. It was a statement of fact. The king had arrived on this coast. He had landed here, and he was not leaving. This was the center of the new world. The first step in building a capital was to clear away the old. The wooden walls of the Aegonfort were torn down, plank by plank, their timbers hauled away to make room for something that would last. In their place, Aegon ordered the construction of a fortress of pale red stone, a stronghold worthy of a dragon king. This was the Red Keep. It was a massive project, an undertaking that would occupy the labor of thousands of stonemasons and craftsmen for decades. Aegon himself would not live to see its final towers rise against the sky, but the act of breaking ground on the Red Keep was a signal to every lord in the realm. The Targaryen dynasty was not a passing storm. It was the bedrock of a new age. As the foundations of the new keep were laid into the hillside, the city of King's Landing began to grow around it, almost organically. It started as a camp of soldiers and servants, a necessary gathering of people needed to support the king. But as the news spread that the Iron Throne had found its permanent home, the trickle of newcomers became a flood. Artisans came to work the stone and carve the wood of the Red Keep, and many of them stayed, opening shops and workshops. Merchants saw the wealth flowing through the court and set up stalls to feed and clothe the growing population. Lords from across the 7 kingdoms, eager to stand close to the source of power, built sprawling manses upon the hills. The 3 hills took on distinct identities. The King's Hill, where the Red Keep stood, Rhaenys' Hill, Visenya's Hill. The city was crude, loud and crowded compared to the ancient elegance of Oldtown, but it pulsed with the raw energy of a capital being born. A king needs a city, and a king needs a court. A dragon king, seated on a throne forged from the swords of his enemies, needed something more immediate. He needed a shield that could never be turned against him. With the advice of his sister Visenya, a woman who understood the value of discipline and absolute loyalty, Aegon established the Kingsguard. It was an order of 7 knights, a number drawn from the 7 faces of the faith, a clever echo of the religion Aegon had embraced in Oldtown. These knights swore a vow that cut them away from the rest of the world. They could hold no lands, they could father no children, they could wear no crowns and win no glory for their own houses. Their lives were forfeit from the moment they took the white cloak. They belonged entirely to the king. The first Lord Commander of the Kingsguard was Sir Corlys Velaryon, a Lord of the Sea, from an ancient house that had long been allied with the Targaryens. The selection of the other 6 knights was a deliberate act of statecraft. Aegon chose men from different regions of the realm, men whose loyalty had been tested in the fires of the Conquest. The white cloaks they wore were a visible symbol of the new order. No longer was the king's safety dependent on the whims of a single great house, or the favour of a local lord. The king had a personal guard, sworn by sacred oath, bound by honour, and protected by the absolute authority of the crown. With the capital rising from the mud of the Blackwater, and 7 of the finest knights in the realm standing eternal vigil over the royal family, Aegon could begin to shift his focus away from the raw business of conquest and toward the deeper work of governance. The building of King's Landing gave him a seat from which to speak for the whole continent. The King's Guard gave him the safety to make difficult decisions. The throne gave him the authority. But the task of keeping the 7 kingdoms from fracturing back into the chaos of warring states had only just begun. The peace would have to be maintained, the great houses managed, and the laws of the new realm written in a language that all could understand. The foundations of King's Landing were being laid, but a capital is not a kingdom. Aegon understood that the loyalty he demanded from his lords could not be sustained through decrees issued from a distant fortress. He had to bring the crown to them, and so, for the latter half of his reign, the king became a traveller. Aegon spent the latter half of his reign travelling the realm on royal progresses, bringing his court to the lords of Westeros. He would move from castle to castle, holding court in the great halls of the very men who had bent the knee to him decades earlier. This was not simply a tour of his domain. It was a deliberate act of statecraft. He heard petitions, settled disputes, and dissolved feuds, all under the open sky of the lands he ruled. Strikingly, he did not try to remake Westeros in the image of Valyria. He respected local customs and laws, slowly integrating them into a unified legal code rather than forcing Valyrian culture on his subjects. The faith of the 7 remained the dominant religion in the south. The ancient laws of the first men still held sway beyond the neck. Aegon's genius was in layering a single crown over these deep traditions, not tearing them out by the roots. The crowning achievement of this careful governance was the creation of the King's Peace. This decree outlawed private wars between noble houses, bringing unprecedented stability to the continent. In the age of the 100 Kingdoms, a border dispute between 2 lords meant raids, burnings, and the deaths of small folk. Under the King's Peace, such conflicts were no longer solved by the sword. They were brought before the Iron Throne. The dragon was now not just an instrument of conquest, but the ultimate enforcer of law. A lord could not simply attack his neighbour. He had to make his case to the king, and the king's word was final. This shift, from the rule of the strongest to the rule of law, redefined the entire relationship between the crown and the nobility. With the peace secured, Aegon's rule transitions from military conquest to administrative brilliance, securing the loyalty of the next generation. The lords who had fought Aegon at the Field of Fire or knelt at the burning of Harrenhal were aging or passing away. Their sons and daughters had grown up, knowing only the Targaryen peace. They had never known a time when a single king did not sit in King's Landing. Aegon fostered this new generation carefully, appointing them to his small council, granting them honours, and marrying them into the loyal houses of the Crown Lands. He built the King's Guard to protect his person, established the Office of the Hand to manage the burgeoning bureaucracy of the state, and formalised the Great Council as a means of settling the most weighty matters of succession and justice. The man who had arrived on the Blackwater with less than 2,000 men had spent the better part of 3 decades building a political machine that could govern without his constant presence. Aegon the Conqueror had become Aegon the Lawgiver. The realm he ruled at the end of his life was a different place than the one he had conquered. It was quieter. The fires of Balerion were mostly banked. The king himself was an old man, his hair gone white, but the peace he forged was still young. It rested entirely on the twin pillars of the dragon and the law. The foundations were strong, but they were yet to be truly tested by the passage of the crown from the founder to his heirs. That test would arrive in the year 37 after the conquest. While at Dragonstone, showing his grandsons the painted table and recounting the tales of his grand campaign, the conqueror suffered a stroke and passed away at the age of 64. His body was burned on a great funeral pyre, cremated by the very fire of Vhagar, leaving behind a united realm but an uncertain future. The crown passed to his eldest son, Aenys, born of his beloved Queen Rhaenys. Aenys was a man of high culture, kind-hearted and artistic, but he lacked the iron will and imposing presence of his father. Almost immediately, the cracks in the newly forged kingdom began to show. Rebels and pretenders, sensing weakness in the new king, rose up in the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Red Mountains of Dawn. Though these initial uprisings were put down with the help of Aenys's fierce half-brother, Maegor, who wielded their father's sword Blackfire, a far greater threat was looming on the horizon. The faith of the Seven, which tolerated Aegon's polygamous marriage out of fear of his dragons, would not extend the same grace to his successor. When Aenys betrothed his own son and daughter to one another, following the ancient Valyrian custom of incestuous marriage, the High Septon denounced the crown, sparking the brutal conflict known as the Faith Militant Uprising. The peace that Aegon had spent decades building was shattered, proving that while dragons could conquer a continent, maintaining a dynasty required a different kind of strength altogether. The Dragon's Peace. It was a fitting name for the final years of Aegon Targaryen's reign. The campaigns were over. The royal progresses had woven the bonds between the crown and its new lords. The Red Keep was rising from the ashes of the old Aegonfort, a permanent symbol of a permanent dynasty. Aegon the Conqueror was no longer just a warlord. He was a king in truth, presiding over a unified continent. He had given Westeros a single law, a single coin, a single throne. But time, the enemy that no dragon can burn, had begun its quiet work on the Conqueror himself. By the 37th year after the Conquest, Aegon was in his 60s. He was still physically imposing, but his hair had gone white, and the fire in his eyes had dimmed to embers. He spent more and more of his time away from the new capital, returning often to the island fortress of Dragonstone. It was there, in the ancient halls of his ancestors, that he found the most peace. He would walk the stone walls of the castle and look out over the narrow sea, perhaps thinking of old Valyria, of the life he had built so far from the doom. He would sit in the chamber of the painted table, running his hands over the carved contours of Westeros. Every river, every mountain, every keep, the map of his conquest. In 37 AC, Aegon was at Dragonstone with his family. His grandsons, the children of his son Aenys, and his daughter-in-law Alyssa Velaryon, were young boys, full of questions. Aegon sat with them in the great hall, telling them stories of the conquest. He spoke of the field of fire, of Harrenhal, of the kings who had knelt and the ones who had burned. The boys listened with wide eyes as the old king told them of Balerion's shadow falling over armies, the sound of swords breaking beneath dragon claws. It was in the middle of one of these stories that the end came. The ancient king stopped speaking. His hand went to his chest. Aegon the Conqueror, the Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, the rider of the Black Dread, collapsed from his seat. He was gone before he hit the stone floor. A sudden stroke, the maesters called it. A silent death for a man who had shaken the world with thunder. The realm had lost its founder. The family had lost its pillar, but custom demanded a send-off worthy of a dragon lord. Aegon's body was anointed with oils and wrapped in the banners of House Targaryen. A great pyre was built in the yard of Dragonstone. The lords of the realm, the household, Queen Visenya, and his son Aenys gathered to witness the cremation. Aenys was the one chosen to light the pyre, but he did not do it with a torch. He did it in the way of old Valyria. He mounted the dragon Vhagar, the same beast that had carried Queen Visenya through the war, and served the Targaryen cause since the beginning. With a command that echoed against the stone, Aenys brought Vhagar low. A single blast of dragon fire roared from the ancient beast, engulfing the pyre. The flames that consumed Aegon the Conqueror were born of the very power that had made him king. The Conqueror was gone, but what he left behind was a double-edged legacy. He had unified 6 of the 7 kingdoms under a single crown. The Iron Throne stood in King's Landing, as a permanent monument to his victory. The laws he had established were the foundation of a new age. The lords of Westeros had been bound by oath and by fear, but the succession was a looming storm. His son, Rhaenys I, was not made of the same steel as his father. Rhaenys was gentle, scholarly, a man more suited to the court than the battlefield. He lacked his father's iron will and the ruthless discipline of his aunt Visenya. The realm he had inherited was peaceful, but it was a peace built on fire. The moment that fire dimmed, the wolves would come sniffing. Rhaenys was weak-willed. He was easily swayed by advisors, prone to compromise, and deeply devoted to the faith of the Seven, in a way that his Valyrian forebears were not. It was clear that the iron fist that had held the Seven Kingdoms together was gone, and a velvet glove was trying to take its place. The wolves of the faith, the lords of the reach, the old resentments that had not fully died in the conquest. They were all waiting. The memory of Aegon the Conqueror became the standard against which all future Targaryen kings would be measured. Every weakness was a failure of his blood. Every compromise was a betrayal of his conquest. The Iron Throne itself, a jagged monument of 1,000 swords, was a constant, cutting reminder: you are not the conqueror. You rule at his pleasure. You inherit his crown, but you can never inherit his fire. Aegon had unified the realm. He had established the law. He had built the capital. But he had named a man who was soft as his heir. Rhaenys I did not have the stomach for the violence that held the realm together. The peace Aegon bought with fire was a fragile thing, resting entirely on the fear of his name. Once that fear was gone, the wolves would gather. The Lord of the Seven Kingdoms was dead. Long lived the king. The question, of course, was whether his legacy would survive the crown it was meant to uphold. The work of the conqueror was done. Now began the work of keeping it. And so, in the 37th year after his landing, Aegon the Conqueror died. His body was consumed by dragonfire, lit by his eldest son Rhaenys. The age of the conqueror was over, but the realm he had built in just over 30 years that remained. The question was whether it could remain. Now that the hand that had forged it was gone, Aegon's death left Westeros in a strange position. His conquest had succeeded in uniting 6 of the 7 kingdoms, but Dorne's independence remains a glaring exception. This is the first great truth of his legacy. The realm was unified on paper, in maps, in titles. The Lord of the 7 Kingdoms ruled over 6. That 7th kingdom, Dorne, stood as a constant, defiant reminder on the southern border of the continent that the Targaryen peace was not absolute. It was a conquest unfinished, a treaty unwritten. The war had officially ended, but Dorne had never knelt. The dragon's fire had burned their castles, scorched their fields, and taken Queen Rhaenys' life, but it had never broken their will. And so the map of Westeros, under the new Targaryen dynasty, contained a permanent flaw, a crack in the foundation laid on the first day of the new era. And what of the symbols of that unity? The Iron Throne stands as a permanent symbol of a unified Westeros, yet the political fractures of the continent simmer beneath the surface. Aegon had commissioned the throne to be forged from the swords of his fallen enemies. Thousands of blades twisted and melted by the black breath of Balerion, the Dread. It was a seat designed to intimidate, to awe, to remind every lord who sat before it of the cost of defiance. But a symbol is only as strong as the authority that backs it. The throne was a monument to conquest, but a kingdom built on conquest alone requires constant vigilance. The great houses of Westeros, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Arryns, the Martells, had bent the knee, but their ancient identities, their local customs, their pride had not been extinguished. They were waiting, watching, testing the new order. And when Rhaenys took the crown, they did not have to wait long. The Targaryen dynasty is established, but without Aegon's strong hand, the realm faces immediate threats from religious zealots and rebellious lords. Aegon had ruled through a combination of overwhelming force and patient governance. He respected the old gods and the new, the traditions of the first men and the Andals. His son Rhaenys was a gentle and learned man, but he was weak. He lacked the conqueror's instinct, for command. Almost immediately, the faith of the Seven rose up in armed rebellion, the faith militant, the warriors' sons and the poor fellows, had been suppressed during the conquest, but they had never been truly eradicated. Now seeing a young indecisive king on the Iron Throne, they saw their chance. They crowned their own king. The realm was suddenly plunged into a civil war between the crown and the church. Rhaenys, unwilling or unable to unleash the full power of his dragon Quicksilver, tried to compromise. He failed. He fled the capital. The realm he inherited fractured before his eyes. The story of the conquest ends, leaving a legacy of fire, blood, and an unfinished empire that will shape Westeros for 3 centuries. The triumph of Aegon the Conqueror was not the final chapter. It was the prologue. The dragons would survive Aegon, but the dynasty nearly died with his sons. Maegor the Cruel took the throne from Rhaenys, and the realm endured a reign of terror. It was not until Jaehaerys the Conciliator that the wounds were bound, but the core paradox remained. Aegon had built a unified state on the backs of dragons, but he had not fully integrated every piece. Dorne remained independent for over 100 years after Aegon's death. The Lords of the Reach and the Rock still measured each other's power. The North kept its distance. The Ironborn raided the shores. The conquest was a moment of fire and blood, a stunning, overwhelming victory that redrew the map of an entire continent. But the peace that followed was a long, slow process of consolidation, compromise, and sometimes collapse. Aegon gave Westeros a crown. He gave it a capital. He gave it a throne forged from the steel of its own defeat. But he could not give it complete unity in his lifetime. That was a task that would take 300 years of Targaryen rule, a civil war that killed the dragons, a dynasty that nearly destroyed itself, and finally, a royal marriage under Daeron the Good to bring Dorne into the fold. The unfinished empire that Aegon left behind was not a failure. It was a project, a great, fragile, terrifying project that this single man had started on a beachhead at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with less than 2,000 men and 3 dragons. And the weight of that project, the legacy of the conquest, the burden of holding the realm together against the forces of rebellion, zealotry, and pride, would haunt the Iron Throne until the very end. Aegon the Conqueror died telling stories. His final campaign was not against a rival king, but against the silence of the grave, fighting it with tales of glory for his grandsons. And in that moment, perhaps the full scope of his achievement is clearest. He did not just build a kingdom, he built a story called the Seven Kingdoms, a story so powerful that it would outlast his dragons, survive his dynasty's fall, and shape the politics of an entire continent for centuries. The conquest was finished. The empire it left behind was not, and that unfinished business became the defining thread of Westerosi history.